Chapter 13. Jack stared at the wreckage. It was no longer smoking. The persistence of the constant thin rain that had arrived in the small hours of the morning enough to dampen the last signs of the blaze that had destroyed the palace. The scorched timbers mocked him, the tumble-down walls all that was left of his mother's pride. There was little else left standing, the fire raging uncontrolled until the rain had come. The gaudy splendour of the palace had been consumed by the inferno that not one soul doubted was no accident. Her body was gone, as was that of the Prussian Schmidt. Jack had not spared himself the sight. He had stood with the rest of the onlookers as the husks had been dragged out, the twin lumps of twisted charcoal bearing no resemblance to the people they had been only the previous day. He had not intervened as they were taken away. His final glimpse of the woman who had given him life was a singed and blackened claw protruding from underneath the hemp sack that had been used to hide the hideous sight of her corpse from the dozens of children drawn to the wreckage. The crowd had melted away now that the drama was long finished. Even the most persistent of the street sellers had packed up and gone, the opportunity to make a penny or two from working the crowd now past. Ballard and Palmer had left with them. They had spoken to Jack, he knew that, but their words were forgotten. He did not know where they had gone or if they would return. He heard the footsteps of someone coming to stand beside him. He had been left alone, the dispersing crowd steering a wide path around the man in the tattered officer's scarlet. One kind soul, a woman he recognized as a regular of the palace, had come to him and bound strips of cloth around his raw and blistered right hand. She had departed, but still he did not move. He simply stood and stared, his mind empty of every thought except one. "You need to come away." Mary spoke with a voice devoid of compassion. "You're doing nothing standing here." Jack did not acknowledge her presence. He continued his lonely vigil, his eyes tracing a path over the destruction. "You should be doing something, not standing here in the rain." Jack could find nothing to say. He held his emotions close, already starting the process of burying them away. "You killed her. Near killed my boy, too." "It's my fault." The words hurt him. They were the first thing he had said for an age, and they tore through the ruined lining of his throat like razor blades. "Of course it's your fault. I told you." Mary's voice wavered, but her eyes blazed with a barely controlled anger. "I told you what would happen, but that didn't stop you because you knew better. You with your fucking red coat and your sword and your bloody toy gun. You, the fucking war hero, knew better than me, a washed-up doxy with a bastard boy." Her hand rose, a single finger pointing towards the smouldering rubble. "You take a good look at that. You see what you brought here, what you did." "I know." Jack did not hide from the accusation. He told himself it meant nothing. The price that others had paid for his decisions just another notch alongside the hundreds already cut deep into his soul. "I said you were a cold bastard, Jack Lark. Your own mother dead and you don't even shed a single damn tear." Mary's lips twisted as she spoke, as if she were chewing on something foul. Jack stayed silent. He knew death. They stood there, side by side in the rain. "You killed your own mother." Mary broke the silence. "The one person in this world who loved you. And you killed her." Jack did not reply, but the words etched themselves deep in his soul. His mother had done her duty, had done the right thing by him. Hers had been a tough love, a love that was delivered with smacks and cuffs around the ear as much as with anything more caring, but she had loved him. It was why he had come back, and he had seen it again every day since he had returned. At least, he thought he had. The grief settled. He stored it away, locking it up with the rest, his mind building the barriers around it that would keep it shackled and hidden. It would stay there, festering in the darkness, never forgotten, but at least constrained. "What are you going to do?" Mary pulled at his arm, making him look at her. "Where will you go?" Jack met her gaze. "I'm going to find him." "Him? Sure?" Mary's hand dropped to her side. "It's over, Jack. He won. Look over there if you don't believe it." Jack shrugged. He tasted the desire for revenge. It was flavoured with smoke and with burning. Mary's gaze did not leave his face. "I have to get back." "Where's Billy?" "Maud took us in." Jack remembered that Maud was the woman who had bandaged his hand. She lived opposite the ginny, coming in a dozen times a day. His mother had sometimes let her help tidy up, even though the old lady was past doing anything useful for more than a few minutes at a stretch. "We can't stay there," Mary continued. "The old dear hasn't got 2 farthings. I need to find us a place, thanks to you." Jack shook his head, wincing in pain as he did so. "I'll take care of you." "Like you did before?" The words came laced with scorn. Jack could not meet her gaze. "I'll see you right." "You will?" It was a statement, not a question. Jack felt the exhaustion then. The need to find a place to rest was making itself known in every battered fibre of his being. He wanted to hide away, to bury himself somewhere until he could breathe without such agony. "I'm going back to my boy. I'll wait for you to send for us. Like it or not, we are your responsibility now. You threw away everything we had, so you're going to make it right. You have to." Jack understood the anger behind her words, yet he heard something else. He heard fear. Mary had lost her employment and her home. In the rookeries, that was enough to start a decline that would end on the streets. Without money, life became unsustainable. If she could not find work, then the only option was the living death of the poorhouse. Her child would be taken from her, severing the tie between them for life. Mary's world had been shattered by the events of that evening, events that Jack had set in motion the minute he had taken his first step over the threshold of the palace all those weeks before. "I'll do what is right," he gave the promise. He saw her chin lift, her battered, sorry pride still there. "You had better." She spoke firmly. There was no trace of grief, no hint of the approach of tears. Her words were as hard as iron. He saw her head turn as someone approached them, the first to dare to do so. It was Palmer his dear stalker held in front of his belly. His thick tweeds were covered with black smoke marks, but his face had been recently cleaned, although inky streaks remained behind his ears and under his chin. "Good evening, love." The large man addressed himself to Mary. "Is your boy recovering?" "He is," Mary replied with surprising politeness. "Thank you for what you did." "It was nothing." Jack scowled. He saw Palmer look at the ground as he spoke to Mary. The older man appeared uncomfortable. Mary smiled. "You saved him. I owe you my son's life." "I bloody saved him." Jack spat out the words, even though they hurt like the very devil. "You bloody put him there." Mary turned on him, her thin smile twisting to a sneer. "It's not Jack's fault, love." It surprised Jack that Palmer would speak up for him. He tried to read the man's expression. Palmer's features showed the wear of his years. His broad nose had clearly been broken a number of times. The rest of the face was fleshy and covered with fine pockmarks, the legacy of some childhood illness. Jack had never seen him look anything other than composed, no matter the situation. Yet now he seemed as awkward as a boy asking to hold a whore's tits for the first time. "It bloody well is his fault." The sharpness returned to Mary's tongue. "I warned him what would happen, but he's too bottlehead stupid to listen. Now his own mother is dead, and her blood is on his hands as sure as if he had cut her throat himself." Palmer winced at the tirade. He did not argue his point, and turned instead to face Jack. "The Major told me to tell you that he's found you lodgings." He dipped his head as he looked at Mary. "For you too, love, and your lad. I'm to take you there." Now. It's not far." Palmer addressed himself to Mary. "You want me to help with the boy?" Mary nodded. "He's not got the strength, not yet. You'll have to carry him." "All right." Palmer was unconcerned. "Is this place clean?" Mary asked, a hint of uncertainty in her voice. "He's clean enough." "I'll go get him ready." She flicked a finger in Jack's direction. "That useless loaf can show you where we are." She did not bother to look at him, but lifted her tattered skirt and walked quickly away to prepare her son for the move. "She doesn't like you very much." Palmer made the observation when Mary was far enough away not to hear him. "No, not any more." "Pity. She's a tidy one." Jack had no interest in Palmer's opinion. "You need to find him." "Who's that then?" "The man who did this. The man you let go." Palmer barked with laughter. "What? You wanted me to snuff him out?" "Why not?" "I'm not a murderer. I leave that to you." Palmer's eyes narrowed as he spoke. "Unless the devil tells you to." "Aye, maybe." Palmer did not bat an eyelid at the accusation. "So, find him. Only if the Major tells me to." Jack felt the first stirrings of anger. "Why's that? Can't you do anything without his say-so?" "I reckon I know what I'm about." Palmer's voice did not change. "I don't need you telling me what's what." "So that's it? Don't you have a mind of your own?" Palmer said nothing. "Fuck me." Jack sagged. He felt broken. "You're nothing but a useless fucking toady." Palmer laughed off the accusation. "And you ain't nothing but a mewling turd. I'll let you off for the moment. I reckon that smoke addled your wits, such as you had." He leaned forward, his face looming towards Jack's. "But call me that again, and so help me I'll rip your fucking throat out." He pulled away and stood straight. "You better show me this house where that poor woman's boy's laid up. Then you can follow me." He gave Jack a grim smile, then gestured with his hand to encourage him to move. Jack looked at the calmness in Palmer's eyes. They both knew the older man could make good on his threat with one hand tied behind his back. He did what he was told and went to find Mary and her boy. Chapter 14. The garret room smelled. The damp was all-pervading, the room chill and miserable. Mould smothered the walls and much of the floor, the dark blue-black smudges all the decoration the place offered. The room could have been warmed, the fireplace ready to be stoked with fuel, but its occupant had no desire to see any more flames, even controlled and safe. So it was left undefended against the conquest of the damp and the mould, invaders as efficient as any British political officer at taking ownership of a land not rightfully their own. Jack lay on the single bed and stared at the ceiling. The days had gone by one after another, their passing unremarked and barely noticed. He was almost recovered, the days of inactivity doing much to ease the pain of the worst of his burns, and to allow for the muck he had inhaled to be spewed into the piss-pot by his bed. His right hand was still bandaged, whilst the left had a splint against his broken finger. With both hands damaged, he was unable to tend to his wounds himself, and was forced to rely on Mary to change his dressings. She spoke little when she ventured upstairs from her room on the floor below. Not even the garret's musty chill could match her icy reserve. She dealt with him out of duty, nothing more. Any compassion burned to a charcoal husk by the same flames that had taken both her place of employment and the woman she had thought of as a mother. Jack stared at the ceiling and conjured a face from a patch of mould above his head. It was the face of the man he would kill, no matter how long it took. One day Shaw would be found, then he would die. The simple fact a small comfort as Jack let his body recover. Shaw dominated his thoughts, with much of his time spent imagining the man's death. Jack had seen many men die, had watched as the final flicker of life departed their eyes. He fed his determination with the image of Shaw's soul fleeing his broken carcass. It was a good image, the kind that could help a man find his strength, the kind that could give purpose to a life bereft of one once again. A knock at the door brought him to his feet. He crossed the room quickly before snatching it open, expecting to see Mary come to perform her duty as a nurse. "Good afternoon, Jack." Ballard could not hide the hint of a flinch at the force with which the door was opened. "You? I'm glad to see you on your feet." Ballard attempted something that could be construed as a smile. Jack made no attempt to invite his former master into the room. His body was healing, but his soul was still blackened. He was not ready to discover what plans Ballard had for his future. "I can return tomorrow." Ballard took half a step backwards. "No." Jack closed his eyes as he summoned the strength he would need. He could not hide away forever. "You can come in, but I give you fair warning that you may regret it." Ballard looked past Jack's shoulder. His thin moustache twitched as he saw what waited for him. "It would be best if we have this conversation somewhere private." He sniffed as he finished speaking, his distaste obvious. "I've left Palmer downstairs. He does not need to hear this." "You'd, best come in, then." Jack stood back and gestured for Ballard to enter. He noted the reference to Palmer's presence in the building, Ballard cautious enough around Jack to have brought his bodyguard. "Sit wherever you want. I would recommend the chest by the window, but you run the risk of getting a splinter in your arse, so perhaps choose the bed. The spot there by the wall is the driest." Ballard's nose twitched as he ran his eyes over the choices Jack had indicated. Neither appealed. He offered a thin-lipped smile to his host, then approached the chest. "Could you not be bothered to light the damn fire? It's colder than a convent in here." Jack snorted at the comparison. "I wouldn't know, as I've not had the pleasure of visiting one." He felt a flicker of enjoyment at Ballard's discomfort. The Major was a staff officer, his wars fought in comfort and far from the dirty business of the battlefield where Jack had found his place. "They are not the jolliest of places, Jack. I do not recommend you finding one to visit. Knowing you would probably steal away one of the novices or else convince the Mother Superior to take you to her bed. Deflowering a bride of Christ would not be good for your soul." Jack shook his head at such foolishness. "I doubt it would matter." "No, perhaps not." Ballard sat down with exaggerated care. He paused, clearly waiting for something sharp to stab him. When it didn't, he summoned a smile and gestured for Jack to sit too. "Will this take long?" "It depends how difficult you are." Jack growled at the barb, then plonked himself on the bed, leaning carefully against the rusty bedstead. His back was painful, the pit of his spine a constant wearing ache that had not been helped by his recent misadventures. How are you?" Ballard had seen the wince. "How do you think?" "Your hands?" Jack held them up towards Ballard as an answer. The splint used to hold his broken finger in place stuck up like a miniature flagpole. "Still sore?" "No, they fucking hurt." Ballard winced at the invective. "I'm sure that will pass. Keep the dressings clean." Jack had no time for any more of Ballard's doctoring. "Have you found Shaw?" "No, not yet." "Palmer is looking for him." Jack grunted. "You won't find him." "You would be surprised. Palmer is like a bloodhound. He can sniff out a troublemaker at 1,000 yards. He's not that bloody good. He let the bastard go." "Really, Jack? You must not blame Palmer." "Why not?" "We cannot kill everyone who crosses our path, as convenient as that may be." "Why not?" Jack repeated. He knew he was being difficult, but he did not care. "I'm going to kill that bastard when I find him, and I don't care who sees." "I'm sure that is true, but I'm afraid it will have to wait." "No, it won't. I'm going to find him, and then I'm going to kill him." "Time has not softened you then, Jack. You're still the same man I found masquerading as a dead officer in Bombay." "Perhaps." Jack refused to be shamed. He knew the manner of man he was. To his surprise, Ballard had looked pleased as he asked the question. Seeing such an expression on the face of the devil made him wary. "I'm glad to hear it. You are a man of unique talents, Jack Lark. They make you a useful fellow to have in one's corner." "I'm not in anyone's corner. Not anymore." "Is that so? I suspect you're keen to find employment, to find a place where you can belong." Ballard's tone changed as he replied. He spoke softly, letting the words hang between them. Jack's mouth opened to denounce the notion, but he saw the way Ballard was looking at him. The intelligence officer knew him well. Too well, it seemed, for he had spoken a truth that Jack was trying hard to ignore. He had been searching for a place ever since he had walked away from that funeral on a dusty hillside outside the broken walls of Delhi. "I'm a free man. I can do as I choose." Jack matched Ballard's quiet tone. "Are you?" Ballard studied him closely. "Are you truly free? Or do you carry your past with you everywhere you go?" Jack could no longer meet Ballard's stare. He glanced up, finding the patch of mould where he had discovered Shaw's face earlier. But the image had gone, the swirling patterns nothing more than the smudges of decay. "It's not your fault, Jack. None of it." Ballard kept his eyes on him. "No man controls his own fate, not you, not I, not even uncompromising fellows like Palmer." He tried to inject some humour, but his voice tailed off as he saw Jack's reaction. "I do." Jack broke the silence, clearing his throat noisily before leaning forward to spit a wad of blackish phlegm into the pot by the bed. "I got my name back. That was my reward, remember?" "The papers weren't destroyed in the fire, then?" "No." For the first time in a while, Jack glanced across at Ballard, who sat easily on the wooden chest, his hands folded neatly in his lap. "I'm not that foolish." "Where are they?" "Cox and Cox." "Along with a rather juicy deposit of funds, I expect." Ballard preened at the jibe, his fingers rising to stroke his moustache. "We never did quite look into how you managed to get hold of that casket." Jack barked a bitter, humourless laugh. "That's long in the past. Not even you would stoop to dredging up such ancient history. I'm a discharged soldier with papers to prove it. I doubt I'm the only redcoat to come back from India with a penny or two to my name." Ballard's hand stopped moving as he contemplated Jack. "Those discharge papers of yours?" His fingers resumed their motion, moving back and forth over his moustache like a cat wiping its paw across its ears. Did you ever look at them? I mean, really look at them. They're a valuable commodity to a man like you, a man keen to leave his past behind him." Jack scowled. He did not like the change in Ballard's tone. "I looked at them." "Did you take a peek at the signature?" Ballard goaded him. "Stalker signed them." Jack had checked his papers a dozen times. Ballard always had his own agenda. He did what suited him and nothing more. Jack had learned that the Major's mind concocted schemes that others had no chance of understanding. His fellow officers on the staff had given him the nickname of the Devil, a moniker that Jack had deemed perfectly fitting from the moment he had first heard it. With Ballard nothing was certain, his scheming brain working at a different speed to that of mere mortals. But Jack was certain of one thing. General Stalker had signed his discharge papers. Stalker had been the commander of the division he had served in during the campaign against the Shah of Persia. He had died shortly after the battle outside the village of Kushab, killed by his own hand, a sad and ignominious end for a fine career soldier. Did he now? Why, that is truly an amazing feat. Jack felt Ballard's grip closing as surely as if he had placed his fingers round his throat. Why? He choked on the single word. Well, the poor fellow had been dead at least a whole day. A corpse signing a set of discharge papers, well, that is nothing short of miraculous. What do you mean? Ballard smiled. It was like a fox spotting the door of the henhouse left ajar. The date, Jack, the date. Did you check the date of the signature? Jack closed his eyes against the pane. No. Ballard rocked back. His hands moved as if to clap, but stopped halfway when he saw the look on Jack's face. He composed himself. They were dated after poor Stalker had killed himself. They are fake, Jack, fake papers for an impostor. Even you must see how fitting that is. Jack let his head fall back so that it rested against the wall behind the bed. Ballard had humbugged him. The devil really is in the detail, Jack. Ballard could not resist aiming the barb, using his own nickname with relish. So, what do you want? Jack did not bother to hide the bitterness in his reply. Ballard held all the cards just as he always had. He had given Jack back his name. At the time it had been everything Jack had wanted. Now it appeared to be nothing more than a trickster's sleight of hand. I want you, Jack. Ballard leaned forward as he replied. I told you once before that I do not care for petty crimes. I am involved in other affairs. Affairs that need not worry about such details. I have a new mission. One where you would be of much use to me, if not invaluable. I want you to come back to work for me. And if I refuse? Ballard sat back, the chest creaking as he shifted his weight. Then there is the small matter of some funds at Cox & Cox, deposited in the name of a certain Jack Lark, a man the army believes died back in '54. If an army agent, especially one as respectable as Cox & Cox, were to discover that a sizable deposit had been made in the name of a dead soldier, well, they would have no choice but to freeze that account. Should a man then present himself claiming to be that very same soldier, then I'm sure our good and respectable friends at Cox & Cox would be duty-bound to have him reported, and I suspect his fate would look rather bleak, especially when he is found in possession of a set of forged discharge papers. Jack knew his former master was more than capable of making good on the threat. Then he would have nothing, no home, no money, and not even a name. He kept his eyes on Ballard, who sat no more than a yard away. It would be an easy thing to kill him. to throttle the life out of the man who appeared to have his fate tucked safely in a pocket. If Ballard were no longer around, there would be no one who knew the truth of Jack's discharge. The money he had stolen and placed at Cox & Cox would still be his, and no one would be any the wiser. His last link to his past would be severed the moment Ballard drew his final breath. Ballard kept his eyes on him. This time he did not smile. "Palmer is just down the stairs, Jack." "You think I would kill you?" Jack snorted even as Ballard read his mind. "I think you would contemplate it. You would not be the man I know you to be if you did not." Ballard paused. "I notice you did not say try to kill me. Do you believe it would be so easy?" For the first time, Jack managed a tight-lipped smile. "Yes." Ballard reacted with mock surprise. "You have seen me in action." "That's why I know it would be easy." Jack had seen Ballard fight. Indeed, the Major had once saved his life, but Ballard was no warrior. "Yet you have not so much as moved a muscle." "I'm thinking." "So you have changed." Ballard smirked at his quick retort. "I do not recall you being very good at thinking before you act. Remember the Munshi?" "No." "You don't recall that man you captured?" Ballard lifted a finger and gestured at Jack's face. "He gave you the smaller of your two scars." Jack's hand rose on instinct to touch the blemish. The larger one, the gift from Delhi, hid most of it. "No, I don't recall." He gave the lie easily. Ballard read him well enough not to say anything further. Instead, he got to his feet, tugging hard on his uniform trousers to smooth out the creases that had formed as he sat. "I shall send Palmer to collect you tomorrow morning at 8. "I've not agreed to work for you yet." "You and I both know that you will." He looked straight at Jack. "You have no choice." Jack let his eyes bore into the Major's. His blackened soul felt empty. "I'm done serving." "What about Mary and her boy?" Ballard spoke softly. "What about them?" "Without me, you have nothing." Ballard played his last card. There was no sense of triumph in his tone. He was in control, just as he always was. "How will you look after them without money?" Jack lowered his gaze. Ballard was correct. If he could not access the funds deposited at the army agent, then he truly was penniless. His actions had destroyed Mary's home and her employment. If he did not take care of her and her son, their future was as bleak as his own. He summoned the will to look up and face Ballard again. "I have no choice, then." "No, Jack, you really do not. But do not feel bad about that." Ballard's expression was one of concern, not victory. "I want you to help me. Do that, and all this will be forgotten." Jack searched Ballard's face. He did not know if the Major spoke the truth, but he found it did not matter. "They cannot stay here. I'll have to find them somewhere better to live, or do you have plans for them too?" "Now that is your first sensible question." Ballard paused as he pondered. "They could be useful." The decision was made quickly. "She can come with us, her boy too." "So where are we going?" Jack asked the question that he knew Ballard wanted to hear. "Why, my dear Jack, I thought you would have guessed. We are going on a little journey." Ballard gave his best attempt at a smile. "We are going back to war." Chapter 15. Jack was bored. He threw the previous day's Times back onto the drum table at the side of his chair before getting up to walk to the window. The rain beat steadily against the glass. the staccato rhythm echoing through the small anteroom that he had sat in for the last 2 hours. At least the room was warm, a fire burning away merrily in the corner fireplace. The flame still made Jack uncomfortable, but the warmth was pleasant, and he was glad to be indoors on such a filthy day. As much as he chafed at the waiting, he could not deny how good it was to be somewhere that felt significant. Palmer had collected him at 8, just as Ballard had ordered. Jack had been brought to Ballard's offices by hackney carriage, and there he'd been left to kick his heels until Ballard returned from a meeting somewhere else in the labyrinthine building not far from Trafalgar Square. The journey with Palmer had been completed in silence. Jack had told Mary where he was going and that he had found them all employment. The conversation had taken place through a barely open door. Mary was reluctant to admit him into the room she shared with her son. Billy was recovering, but it would still be days before he was well enough to be up and about. Jack had glimpsed the boy over Mary's shoulder, his guilt flaring as he saw the lively urchin laid up under blankets, his eyes dull and listless. "Good morning, my dear Jack. Good morning indeed." The door to the room was thrown open and Ballard bustled in, a look of satisfaction plastered across his face. "Good afternoon." Now, do not start our day together with such churlishness," Ballard admonished. "I have enjoyed a successful meeting with our sponsor, and I will not allow you to sully my mood." "Our sponsor?" "I shall tell you more. Indeed I shall, but this is not the time. Tell me what you know of the northernmost Italian provinces." The request took Jack off guard. It was typical of Ballard to assume that everyone else's mind could perform the same mental somersaults as his own. "A little?" The habit of not admitting a lack of knowledge was buried deep. His mother had taught him to read and write passably well, but he had not enjoyed much more than a rudimentary education. Much of what he had learned had come from his first regiment, whose colonel had allowed his brighter soldiers a few hours a week in the regimental library. His career as a charlatan officer had made him adept at dodging questions about matters that he did not know a thing about, although in truth very few of his fellow officers had asked him much at all, their education, more often than not, as patchy and as scant as his own. "Shall we sit?" Ballard gestured at the club chair Jack had recently vacated before taking another for himself. "Our friend Napoleon has sparked something of a crisis in the region." He raised an eyebrow as he looked at Jack. "You have heard of Napoleon III, Emperor of France?" "Of course," Jack replied as he sat. In truth, he knew little, but he assumed Ballard would be unable to resist giving a lecture, so he doubted that his lack of knowledge would matter. "Good man, you are not totally hopeless then. So, our friend Napoleon, I suppose we must call him a friend after the Crimea, has created something of a situation. Reports coming from Paris indicate that he and his new best friend, Vittorio Emanuele III of Sardinia, are cooking up trouble for the poor Habsburgs. If what we have discovered is correct, Vittorio and Napoleon have hatched a plan to turf the Austrians out of Lombardy and Venice. Once their aim is achieved, that kingdom will be added to that of Sardinia, in return for Vittorio ceding the French-speaking areas of Savoy and Nice back to Napoleon. I don't know how much you know of this area, but it is made up of a messy hodgepodge of tiny states with more petty jealousies than a girl's boarding dormitory. They have this damnable notion of unifying together. Italy for the Italians, they say. Italy means nothing, of course, just a geographical term if you ask me, but they believe in it, the stupid fools. One only has to look at the uprisings back in 48 to see how touchy half of Europe is about such things. Ballard scowled as he saw Jack struggling to keep up. "Are you quite well, Jack? You look like you're sucking on a lemon." Jack shifted in his seat. "Perhaps you could go a little slower." "My dear Jack, we have much to do and I cannot waste time. The chase is on." "What chase?" Ballard preened as Jack snapped at the lure. "Now is not the time for your questions. So, you are familiar with the area of which I speak?" No. Ballard rocked back in his chair and clapped his hands before giving his odd bark of a laugh. You are priceless, Jack. Absolutely priceless. The Kingdom of Sardinia is to be found in an area south of the Alps, in the passes of Savoy and the plains of Piedmont, in what some would call the north of Italy. Jack felt the burn of embarrassment on his cheeks, but he did his best to ignore it. He could not help but be intrigued, and Ballard was a good lecturer, even if he did go a little too fast. Vittorio Emanuele has risen up against the Austrians before. Ballard kindly overlooked Jack's blushes and carried on. The last time was in 48, when half of Europe smelled the miasma of revolution. A fellow called Graf Johann Radetzky, Austria's viceroy in Milan, crushed the revolt rather brutally. There were 2 battles, one at Costosa and one at Novara. The poor Sardinians took a beating, but that didn't stop them from helping us in the Crimea. Ballard paused and frowned. I almost forgot. You were there. Were you not? Perhaps you saw them. He raised an eyebrow in Jack's direction. No. Jack saw the flash of annoyance in Ballard's eyes. The Major had discovered much of Jack's past, but not all. Jack had never revealed anything about his time in the Crimea, something that vexed the intelligence officer immensely. Ballard's brow furrowed deeper. I still don't know your whole story, do I, you damned rogue? And I see that you plan to keep it that way. He sniffed as Jack stayed silent. One day you will tell me everything. One day you will learn to keep your beak out of business that doesn't concern you. I doubt that. Ballard laughed off the belligerent reply. If I ever become that dull, you have permission to shoot me. Very well. Jack kept his reply cool. Ah, I do not doubt that you would. Ballard shook his head slowly. I missed you, Jack. I never realized until this moment quite how much. I didn't miss you. Jack fought the urge to smile. You are not a very convincing liar. I'm astonished that you could last so long as an impostor. Ballard's eyes twinkled. So, back to the matter in hand. Vittorio helped us in the Crimea, and that earned him a seat at the peace conference that followed. That in turn gave him the opportunity to put this whole Italian problem on the table. Not even Palmerston could ignore something slapped right in front of his damned face, though I expect the old fellow was too distracted by being awarded the Order of the Garter to mind for long. Ballard offered his tight-lipped smile as he spotted Jack hanging on his every word. Now, as I said, Napoleon and Vittorio have been plotting, and our sources tell us that their preparations for war are well underway. The Sardinian army, such as it is, has mobilized and is now massing on the border with Lombardy. Vittorio has called up all his reservists, and the French are manufacturing like mad. Napoleon is just like his bloody uncle in that he thinks the artillery can win battles all by themselves. The man's factories cannot make cannon fast enough. He's wrong. It's the infantry who wins battles. Jack could not hold back the comment. I agree. Ballard nodded, encouraging Jack's involvement. Although, if I recall correctly, the cavalry nearly managed the whole affair in Persia. Perhaps. But the Persians didn't hang around long enough to make it a proper fight. You sound disappointed. No, it's what happened. Jack had ridden with the cavalry that day. If their line had stood their ground, the outcome could have been very different. You are correct, I'm sure. Ballard ceded the point to Jack. It will be interesting to see how these Sardinians stand. Jack heard the first clue as to what Ballard was planning. You will be there. Ballard waved the comment away. Everything in its time, Jack. Everything in its time. The French and Sardinians are not standing alone. Even the bloody revolutionaries are getting involved. Have you heard of a chap called Garibaldi? He gave Jack no time to reply. The man is a bloody pain in the backside. He wants to create a state of Italy, can you believe? He has about as much chance of that as I do of becoming Prime Minister. But for the moment, his interests are aligned with those of Vittorio, and so he's turned his own private army over to strengthen the Allied force. Of course, if we know this, then so do the Austrians. The Emperor has reinforced his forces in the region, and some 65,000 men have been recalled from furlough. The Habsburgs have huge resources to call on. The empire has thrived in the years since the Congress of Vienna back in 15. It now consists of Upper and Lower Austria, Salzburg, Tyrol, Carinthia, Carnolia, Littoral, Bohemia, Moravia, Silesia, Galicia and Lodomeria, Hungary, Croatia, Slavonia, Dalmatia, Transylvania, the Voivodeship of Serbia, and the Banat of Timisoara, and of course Lombardy and Venetia. Ballard took a sharp intake of breath as he finished reeling off the long list of duchies and kingdoms that formed a part of the enormous territory. "What are we going to do?" Jack asked the question. "We fought alongside the French and the Sardinians in the Crimea. Will we do so again now?" "No, at least I don't think so. Things with the French are a little frosty after that Orsini affair. I have no idea why Napoleon is so shocked that someone would try to assassinate him, but he is certain that we had our finger in that particular pie. Even though Palmerston tried to appease him by introducing a bill to make it a felony to plot here to murder someone abroad, Napoleon still won't trust us. Of course, that bill is what got Palmerston kicked out of office, and even though it's looking quite possible that he will return as Prime Minister after all this messing about with the election, I would think we would keep out of this one and leave it to the French. But that does not mean there is not a role for us to play, albeit a minor one." Jack was starting to understand the situation. "Go on." Ballard sat back in his chair, his fingers lifting to toy with his moustache. "Have you heard of the practice of sending observers to a foreign war?" "I have," Jack nodded. "That is to be our role." Ballard smacked his hand onto his knee and sat forward quickly. "What say you to that?" "We're just going to watch." "You have it exactly." Jack thought he saw something hidden in Ballard's expression, as if he were not telling the whole story. But the idea of going to Italy as an observer made sense, and it gave Jack a reason for being there. He might not be political, but he knew war. The notion of observing intrigued him. It would be a relief to stay on the sidelines as three armies slugged it out. There would be no fighting, no sucking up the courage to lead men into battle, and no bowel-wrenching fear. "You want me to come with you?" Jack kept his voice level, as if the notion neither interested nor pleased him. "I do. Palmer will be with me, but I like to be prepared, and I have a fancy that somewhere along the line you will be useful to me. The woman and her boy can come with us too. We shall not strictly be on campaign, so I think we can allow ourselves a little comfort. I would imagine she'll be able to take care of us rather nicely." Jack tried not to guffaw. Ballard was the shrewdest man he had ever met, but in some ways he was most definitely an innocent. "I am sure Mary will be more than capable. Her lad, too." "Very good. We shall be a merry little party indeed." Ballard's eyes narrowed as he thought on his plans. "You can keep your name. No one but I knows the truth about that, and it will be too complicated to change it now." "That is very good of you." "Capital!" Ballard missed the dollop of sarcasm. "I shall sort out the paperwork this afternoon. We do not have long." "Why's that?" "We must be on our way. The Austrian foreign minister, Graf, they're all some sort of bloody Graf, Ferdinand von Boel-Schauenstein, just issued an ultimatum to Vittorio demanding Sardinia's immediate unilateral disarmament. Surely they won't agree." "We will make a statesman of you yet." "No, Vittorio will not agree, not with Napoleon whispering sweet nothings in his ear. He is certain to refuse." "Which means?" "Which means, my dear Jack, that Europe is about to go to war." Ballard ran a single finger across his moustache, then smiled. "And that means that so are we." Chapter 16. Paris, May 1859. Jack eased off his boots, then tossed them to the ground, a sigh of pleasure escaping his lips even as their pungent aroma caught his nose. It had been a long day, and he was tired. The small walled courtyard behind the house where they were lodging was a wonderful haven tucked away from the bustle of the city. He could smell the lavender that rambled near the rear wall, its scent a delicate balm against his own stink. He sat at a small metal table, his feet resting on gravel, relishing the peace and the shade. It felt good to sit in the cool, and his breathing slowed as the frustration of the day began to leave him. "What the devil is wrong with you?" Mary had seen him arrive, and now she bustled out into the courtyard, her face creased into a scowl as she saw him sitting at ease. Jack spotted that she had a mug in her hand. "If that tea is for me, then I shall marry you this instant." Mary snorted. "Don't flatter yourself." She held out the battered tin mug. "You can have it, I suppose." Jack took it gratefully. He had failed to win Mary over. She still treated him with icy disdain. Not that he blamed her. He had ruined her world, her current employment little reward for everything she had lost. He had not forgotten, sure. But the choice he had faced had been simple. Accept Ballard's offer and give both him and Mary a place, or spurn it and spend days or weeks hunting for revenge. There was only one thing he could do, and so Shaw was left in peace, for the moment at least. "Thank you." He cradled the hot mug in both hands. His right hand was still bandaged, but the splint had been removed from his broken finger. It was crooked and hurt like the devil if he caught it at the wrong angle, but it served as a reminder of a debt left unpaid. "You can bring the mug back in when you go for a wash." The ever-present scowl on Mary's face deepened a fraction as her nose wrinkled at the smell coming from Jack's bootless feet. "It's been a hard day. I think I'll rest here a while." "A hard day? I think you've forgotten what a hard day's work is really like." Jack did not rise to the bait. He took a first tentative sip of the steaming liquid, closing his eyes as the taste of it filled his mouth. When he opened them again, he caught Mary staring at him. She looked away quickly when she saw him notice her scrutiny. "Did you get everything on the list I gave you?" The question was snapped at him. "Some of it." "Some? You've been gone for hours, yet you didn't get everything?" "It was hard." "Hard? What is hard about spending Mr. Ballard's money on a few necessities?" Jack was too tired to argue. "It's not London." "Is that so?" Mary's sarcasm was biting. "Well, I'm right glad you told me. I thought I was still in bloody Whitechapel." Jack laid his head back. Most of the courtyard was in shade, but he felt a single beam of sunlight wander pleasantly across his face. He could also feel Mary's eyes boring into him. "So, are you just going to sit there?" "Only if I'm left in peace." "There's work to be done. You know how Mr. Ballard likes everything ready when he returns?" Jack kept his eyes closed even as he mocked her. "Mr. Ballard," he imbued the honorific with a liberal dose of scorn, "can go take a running jump. I've done enough for one day." "And what have you done exactly?" She did not give him a chance to reply. "Wandered about gawping when you should have been grafting, that's what." "It wasn't like that." Jack rocked forwards, opening his eyes so he could glare at Mary. "This bloody city's full of lunatics. All they do is shout and wave their bloody arms. Is that why you didn't get half the things you was told to? Because someone raised their voice and waved their arms at you?" Jack could not help but smile as Mary gesticulated in a parody of his description. He could still see the girl he had once loved underneath the scowl. "I got what I could." "And it ain't enough. I can't feed me and me boy on what you brought, let alone Mr. Ballard and his man." "Then you go and get something. None of the buggers speak English. You have to shout and point, and even then you still don't get what you bloody want." Jack let some of his frustration show. "It wasn't this hard in India." "I got plenty to do already, thank you very much." She placed her hands on her hips and stared at Jack. "You've got to go back out." "No, I don't." "We need more meat. There's a boucherie, or whatever they call it, just down the road." "I went there. The man's a maniac." "I don't care. I can't feed us all on 3 slices of ham." Jack did not answer. He closed his eyes and wondered where he might find some peace. He heard the sound of a door slamming and then footsteps. It appeared that peace would prove to be elusive that afternoon. "Good day to you both." Jack did not bother to open his eyes as Ballard came into the courtyard. He heard the Major's boots on the gravel, his short, quick steps as identifiable as his voice. "Good afternoon, sir." Mary's voice welcomed her master. "My dear Mary, what a day. I say, is that tea I spy?" Let me fetch you a cup, sir. Just brewed it is." "That would be magnificent." Jack grimaced at the interaction between the two, the formality grating. He opened his eyes to see Ballard standing with his hand on the back of the chair where Jack's feet were currently resting. "Move your feet, there's a good fellow." He slowly eased himself into a more upright position. "You look exhausted, Jack. Has Mary been working you hard?" Jack scowled, an expression that deepened as he heard Mary's loud and derisive snort from somewhere indoors. "I have news." Ballard sat down quickly. Jack sat straighter. The Major was full of beans, which usually meant he had something of note to tell. "Well, go on." Ballard offered a half-smile at Jack's interest. "A moment, if you will. I have dust in my throat." "Have mine." Jack pushed his tea towards the Major. Ballard's smile widened. "I wouldn't dream of coming between you and your tea. We can wait a moment. I'm sure Mary will not be long." He made a show of settling into his chair. Jack bit his tongue, then drank his tea. He knew Ballard would keep him waiting simply because he could, so it was best not to show that it bothered him. "Napoleon has left the city." The Major finally broke the silence just as Mary approached with a tray. In contrast to Jack's battered tin mug, Ballard's tea had been served in a fine bone china cup with a matching saucer. "Thank you, my dear." He nodded his thanks to Mary before turning back to look Jack in the eye. "Everyone who is anyone is on their way to Piedmont." Jack's feigned indifference had ended the moment Ballard started to speak. "So it begins." Ballard sat forward, his childish game forgotten. "Indeed, although it appears Napoleon may already be too late. The Sardinian army stands alone until the French forces can get to the theatre of war. The Austrians outnumber them by at least 2 to their every 1. If the Austrians go for the Sardinians' throat, it could all be over before it has truly begun." "How long until the French get there?" "It should be soon, but quite frankly, the French are in something of a mess. They knew this thing was coming, but they were still not ready. At least now that the order to mobilize has come, they're getting on with it, and their first divisions are already on the move. There are trains from Paris that go directly to Toulon or Marseille. From there it is but a short sea crossing to Genoa. There is also a second route by train from Paris to Saint-Jean-de-Maurienne, followed by a quick march through the Alps to Susa in Piedmont. Even as we speak, some 4,000 labourers are working around the clock to keep the passes through the Alps clear." Ballard spoke briskly as he detailed the French movements. "The railways are making all the difference. Journeys that would take days on foot can now be done in a few hours. This is modern war, Jack. Using all the advances that have been made, imagine what the first Napoleon could have done if he were alive today. Why, I fear we would all be speaking French within a year." Jack hid a smile. It was rare to see Ballard so animated. "When are we off?" Ballard beamed with pleasure at Jack's question. He fished in a pocket and pulled out a small pile of tickets, which he brandished at Jack. "We leave first thing in the morning for Marseille. I got you, Palmer, and the boy second-class tickets. Mary will join me in first. I would not feel happy leaving her with such company as inhabits a second-class carriage." Jack did his best not to spit out his tea. Ballard clearly had no idea of Mary's past. Jack had no intention of altering that. It was much more fun to see the Major treat her as if she were a shy wallflower. He remembered Mary in her heyday, with her bright red stockings and the wild mane of hair that had intoxicated many a punter. If Ballard saw her as she had been then, Jack had no doubt that his rose-tinted image would change in an instant. The Major sipped from his cup. "I say, this tea really is rather delicious. Mary certainly knows how to handle a teapot. She's a girl of many talents. Indeed." "She needs a husband." Jack smiled as he teased his commander. Ballard frowned at the notion. "I rather assumed she had one. At least, had once had one." He looked at Jack. "Her boy." "Ah," Jack understood. "No, sir, he's a bastard, all right." "I see." Ballard hid his expression behind another sip of tea. When the cup was lowered, a scowl was firmly in place. "That is hard on Billy. A boy needs a father, even if he cannot play as full a part in his child's life as he might wish. What would you know?" The mockery escaped Jack's lips before he could hold it back. He heard something in the Major's tone that he had not noticed before. Ballard did not look at him. "I have a son." He made the admission quietly. "I had no idea." "I cannot see him as much as I would like." Ballard's eyes were still averted. "After his mother passed away, I sent him to reside with my cousin until he was of age to attend school. We were in India at the time, and it seemed the wisest course of action." His eyes lifted to look at Jack. "You know what it is like in India. It is not a place for a child without a mother." Jack tried not to squirm. Seeing Ballard uncomfortable was like seeing a mother stare at a much younger man with lust in her eyes. "No, perhaps not." Ballard drank the last of his tea. "Life is not always what we would choose it to be." He fixed Jack with his firm stare. "But sometimes the choice of action is clear. When something needs to be done, one must simply do it. Is that not right, Jack?" Jack did not fully understand the question. "I suppose." "A meek answer! I did not expect that of you." Ballard placed his empty cup forcefully into its saucer. "Come, we have much to do if we are to leave in the morning." He got to his feet, nodding to Jack before bustling away. Jack did not know what to make of Ballard's revelations. But the Major was correct. There was plenty to be done before the morning, so he drained his mug and bent forward to retrieve his boots. Chapter 17. "I reckon I can walk faster than this." Mary's son, Billy, offered the comment, his nose pressed hard against the glass of the second-class carriage's smoke-streaked window. "Shut your damn muzzle," growled Palmer. His deerstalker pulled low over his face as he tried to sleep. He was sitting next to the youngster, and so had to endure the worst of the boy's constant fidgeting. "For Christ's sake, keep still." "Keep your voice down." Jack sat on the other side of Palmer. He found the boy's constant moans just as wearing, but he couldn't resist taking the boy's side, if only to goad the bigger man. Palmer looked at Jack out of the corner of his eye. The compartment was cramped. Palmer took up most of Billy's space as well as his own, and his large knees pressed close to the French soldier sitting on the bench opposite. Jack caught Palmer's glance, then nodded towards the three men on the opposite side of the compartment. "Keep it down. I doubt they want to hear you bawling the boy out." "Like I give a shit." Palmer looked at the three men opposite. Two were trying to sleep, but the man in the middle seat was staring balefully at the three English travellers. All three were dressed in uniform, one Jack half recognised. There was something familiar about the dark blue jacket with long tails, The green epaulets with red crescents, the baggy, lightweight white campaign trousers, and the jaunty red kepi, but he could not place the regiment. The man staring at them had a tanned, lean face, and Jack guessed he was in his early 20s. His uniform bore the red stripe of a sergeant on the lower part of his sleeve near the cuff, as did those of his two companions. "Where you from?" Jack asked the question as he caught the Frenchman's eye, hoping the man would be able to speak English. In truth, he was as bored as Billy. The train had started with bustling purpose and had flashed through the outskirts of Paris at a terrific rate. But after just over an hour, the locomotive's speed had slowed to barely a crawl. They had been creaking and rolling along at a walking pace for the past 2 hours, and the slow progress was stretching everyone's nerves. "Boston." The answer was given without enthusiasm. The soldier's expression did not change. "You're American?" Jack blurted the inevitable question. He had not known what to expect, but the sergeant's accent had still taken him by surprise. The Bostonian shrugged. It was all the answer he gave. "Leave the man alone." Palmer spoke out of the side of his mouth. "He doesn't want to talk, especially not to you." Jack gave Palmer's advice no heed. "What's an American doing in the French army?" He looked more closely at the sergeant. He wore his hair long and tucked behind his ears, and sported a small goatee that framed a mouth bearing a hint of a smile. "Fighting, mainly." The man's eyes moved between Jack and Palmer. His accent was strong. "What regiment are you from?" Jack wanted to know. "Le 12e Régiment Étranger." Jack recognized the name. He had seen one of the French Foreign Legion's regiments in the Crimea, and it had been the subject of many conversations between the British officers. There were many tales about the Legion, and even more about the men who served in it. Its ranks were filled with the flotsam and jetsam of Europe, the regiment content to recruit any man who came to them. Those who joined were given a choice. They could keep their identity and the past that came with it, or they could abandon everything about the person they had been and let the Legion give them a new name. Rumour had it that many chose the second option. "Were you in the Crimea?" He watched the American carefully as he asked the question. "Yes." "The Alma?" The man nodded. "And after, at Sebastopol." He was watching Jack just as closely. "You were there?" It was a statement, not a question. "The Alma." Again the silent nod as the man contemplated Jack, his eyes boring into his for an uncomfortably long period of time. Then he reached up to the knapsack on the shelf above his head, his fingers searching for something. He gave a short snort as he found what he was looking for, pulling out a dark green bottle. "Have you been to India?" "Yes." Jack watched as the man uncorked the bottle. "Then you'll like this." The American lifted the bottle to his nose to inhale the aroma coming from the open top. He paused, lifting it towards Jack as if making a toast, then took a long swig, his eyes closing in silent ecstasy. When they opened again, he was smiling for the first time. "Here." He held it out to Jack. "Drink." Jack took the bottle and gave it a circumspect sniff. He noticed young Billy watching him closely, and even Palmer had half opened a single eye. The smell coming from the bottle made his eyes water, but he recognized it well enough. "Arak." The American tilted his head to one side in acknowledgement of the guess. "Not quite, but it's similar." "Give it a try." The instruction sounded more like an order than an offer. Jack did as he was told. The liquid hit the back of his throat, the burn and the rush of fumes just as he remembered. He swallowed, the fire sliding down his gullet to burn in the depths of his stomach. It took a moment to control the heady rush before he could hand the bottle back. "It's good." The words came out as a hoarse whisper. This time the American sergeant laughed. No, it's goddamn awful, but, I find it does the trick. Jack laughed with him. It does that. He made a play of wincing and shaking his head, making the sergeant laugh loud enough to wake up his two companions. What are your names? Jack's throat still burned, but he managed to sound more normal as he asked the question. That is Marceau. The American nudged the man on his left. He's Swiss. By rights he should be in the 1st Regiment, but the man is a fool, and so he got stuck with us in the old 2nd. He shook his head, the name he had given his own regiment clearly not agreeing with him. The fat oaf by the window is Baranowski, and my name is Carney. Ah, you started without me. Marceau saw the bottle in Carney's hand and immediately reached for it. He too spoke in English, but with a heavy accent. Carney nodded towards Jack. My new friend fought in the Crimea. Marceau swigged a good measure of the powerful liquor, then glanced at Jack over the bottle. Then you earned a drink. It was hard fighting out there. It was. Jack held out a hand. Marceau smirked, then handed him the bottle. We found that English officer there. You remember him, Carney? He used his elbow to prompt the man sitting to his right. The one with the hole in his guts. Carney's face changed as he searched his memory, then split into a smile as he found what his comrade was referring to. Oh, yeah. The one who told us he was quite fine even though we could see his backbone through his stomach. Yes, that is the one. Marceau gave Jack an encouraging smile as he took a second measure of the arak. You like it? No. No, me neither. Marceau shrugged. But it's cheap, and it does what it's meant to do. He reached over and retrieved the bottle, then nudged the sergeant on the far side of Carney with its base. The man took it, but said nothing. Carney saw Jack look across at the man by the window. Don't mind him. He's a Pole. He doesn't speak English. He nodded to his comrade as the bottle was passed back. You cannot get the chance to speak English very often. We have Englishmen. They don't find it so easy to learn French. How many Englishmen are there in your ranks? Carney moved his lips as he contemplated the question. Not so many. We don't ask about a man's past in the Legion. Who he is now is all that matters to us. We concern ourselves with what he becomes, not what he was. Sounds like my kind of place. Jack saw Billy hanging on their every word, so he reached across and took the bottle from Carney, then handed it to the boy. Taste that, lad. It'll put hairs in your chest. The 3 sergeants from the Legion all beamed as Billy took hold of the bottle before raising it to his lips. He drank, the liquid sloshing loudly. His eyes widened, then he choked. Tears streamed down his face as he half threw the bottle back to Jack before clutching his hands to his throat. The men laughed at the display. Even Palmer managed to smile. As if on cue, the locomotive jolted heavily before lurching forward, finally picking up speed. The French countryside began to slide past the window at an ever-increasing rate as the troop train resumed its former clattering rhythm. Jack saw the Legion sergeants share a look. They were men going to war, and he felt a pang at being the outsider, at not sharing their feelings. He would have no place on the battlefield, but he sensed that he would not avoid becoming involved in the conflict that was drawing in men by the thousand. There would be war in Europe, and he knew with utter certainty that he would be a part of it. Chapter 18. Genoa, May 1851. Nothing. Jack grimaced as he squeezed through the crowd. Nothing. Damnation! Ballard's frustration was getting the better of him. The quayside was bedlam. Ballard's party was pressed together at the end of the quay, their luggage piled around their feet.
Hundreds of troops were disembarking from the transport ship, the ranks of French infantry filling every inch of space as they filed past, their sergeants and corporals swearing and shouting at their charges to move quicker. Jack stumbled as he emerged from the scrimmage, ducking under a musket that was being carried balanced over a Frenchman's shoulder. He had been sent to try to locate some porters to help get the party away from the dock. There was no one save for swarms of onlookers who had thronged to the port to see the French troops arrive. Palmer had gone with him, but had left Jack to report back to Ballard whilst he tried to find them some kind of conveyance to get them to a place where they could stay. "We'll have to shift for ourselves." Jack wiped the sleeve of his jacket across his sweat-streaked face. "Do not tell me the damned obvious." Ballard was the only one of the group in uniform. He still wore the dark blue of the 15th Hussars, even though it was many years since he had served in the regiment's ranks. Jack and Palmer were dressed in civilian clothes, their heavy jackets and thick trousers ill-suited to the heat that had assailed them the moment they had disembarked. "Well, get on with it then." Jack was in no mood for Ballard's waspishness. He bent low to pull the largest trunk towards him. "Bloody hell, whose is this?" "That is mine." Ballard knocked Jack's hands off the trunk. "I shall take it. Help the others." "What have you got in there? That bloody thing weighs a ton." "Necessities, nothing more. Now get out of my way." Ballard shouldered Jack to one side, then took hold of the trunk's handles. With a grunt and a strain, he just about managed to lift it. "Get on with it," he exhorted Jack before taking a first awkward step, the trunk banging painfully against his knees as he did so. Jack grabbed his own knapsack and slung it onto his shoulder before starting to collect the valises and portmanteaus that contained the rest of their possessions. "Give us a bloody hand, boy," he growled at Billy, picking up a valise and tucking it under his arm. "Don't take it out on him." Mary pulled her own bag from the ground. "Ain't his fault." Jack gritted his teeth. He was already carrying 3 bags and was trying to slide another one up the side of his body so he could tuck it under his right arm. Somehow he managed the trick. Mary and Billy gathered the rest. With his back bent, he crabbed his way after Ballard. It was not a great start to their campaign. "Have you ever seen anything like it?" "No." Jack answered Palmer's question honestly. The pair stood at the window in their room, looking out over the street. The room was large, but completely empty save for their luggage. It was the only accommodation Palmer had been able to find, and all 5 of them would have to share the one space. The wide boulevard outside the window led directly down to the docks. It was the main thoroughfare through Genoa, and it was packed solid with the French army, as what looked to be an entire army division picked its way through the city. Everywhere Jack looked, he saw infantrymen bowed low under the weight of their campaign equipment. Behind them came a dozen guns, the large cannon followed by limbers and wagons full of ammunition. The noise was constant. The sound of countless pairs of boots hitting the ground echoed along the streets as the troops marched as best they could in the melee. All the while shouts and orders were bellowed, the men charged with maintaining order fighting against the difficulties of moving so many soldiers in such a confined space. Jack turned to face the room. Mary was doing her best to organise the chaos of the luggage that had been dumped here, there and everywhere. Billy had disappeared the moment they had arrived, keen to explore his surroundings. Ballard had left them too, eager to find someone in authority who could provide him with the papers he would need to requisition some transport so that they could accompany the army when it left Genoa. "My eye." Palmer spoke quietly, his gaze still riveted on the scene outside. "Those things look evil." He was looking at the artillery battery filing past below the window. "I bloody hate cannons." Palmer caught Jack's eye. "Don't we all, chum?" "You served?" He knew little of Palmer's past, but he recognised the look in his gaze. Palmer nodded. Before your time.
Jack was intrigued. He had no idea how old Palmer was, so he made a guess.
India? For a bit.
Against the Sikhs?
Maybe.
Palmer refused to be drawn. Jack wanted to press, but he knew what it was to have demons. There had been hard fighting in India in the years before he had journeyed to its shores. He guessed Palmer was around 10 to 15 years older than he was. That meant he could easily have seen action against the Sikhs or the Afghans, maybe both, and others besides. Makes you want to drink,
doesn't it just?
Jack still wanted to know more. It was the closest thing to a proper conversation he had ever had with Palmer. It was worth celebrating, so he turned to call across to Mary. "We got anything to drink, love?"
"I ain't your love, and no, we haven't."
Jack heard Palmer grunt in sympathy.
"In my pack."
Jack turned sharply. The other man had spoken so softly that he had barely heard the words.
"In my pack."
The instruction was repeated as Palmer kept his vigil at the window. Jack needed no more of an invitation. He walked to Palmer's knapsack, ignoring the disapproving glare on Mary's face. It was heavy, so he squatted on his haunches, pulling open the straps. He saw the bottle of brandy immediately. It was 3/4 full. The sight made him smile. He had never seen Palmer drinking, but it was clear that Ballard's man enjoyed a nip here and there. He pulled out the bottle and was about to stand when he saw something bright, half hidden beneath a spare shirt. He glanced at Palmer, but the man was paying him no attention, his gaze still fixed on the column passing by in the street below. Jack slipped his fingers underneath the shirt and took hold of the object that had caught his attention. He checked that Palmer was still looking away, then took a glance at what he had found. It was an oval picture frame, no bigger than the palm of his hand. He looked down at the smiling image of a small girl about 8 or 9 years old. She was a pretty thing, with blonde hair and a pair of bright blue eyes. It was a simple picture, the kind that would cost a proud parent a few shillings, but the artist had still captured something of the child, a quirky half-smile on her face that was quite captivating. He looked up to see Mary staring at him. She shook her head but said nothing, her opinion of his prying obvious. He slipped the portrait back into its place underneath the clean shirt, then fastened the straps on the knapsack before straightening up and taking the brandy across to the window. "This what you wanted?"
Palmer glanced down and nodded. "Aye. A man needs to be prepared."
He reached for the bottle.
"You saw her, then?"
He asked the question without looking at Jack. For a moment, Jack thought about lying, but he did not sense anything in Palmer's tone that made him wary, so he answered truthfully. "Yes."
"My daughter."
Still, Palmer did not look at him.
"Elizabeth."
"She's a pretty child." From where he stood at the man's side, Jack could see that Palmer was no longer looking at the French troops, but was instead staring straight into the sky.
"She is."
Palmer smiled as he spoke.
"She's as pretty as an angel."
Despite the warmth in the room, Jack shivered. The image of Palmer's daughter reminded him of another child, another face that only appeared in his nightmares. That child had died in a back alley in Delhi, murdered in front of his eyes. For an instant he was there and he froze, the image searing into his mind with such force that it sent a shudder surging through him.
"Here."
Jack looked up to see that Palmer was offering him the brandy.
"Have a dram or two."
Jack reached gratefully for the bottle. He felt no shame that Palmer had surely spotted his reaction. He had seen the same look reflected in the big man's eyes.
They stood and drank, neither speaking as they watched the horde passing by, the long procession of men and wagons crawling along. "I just do not understand it." Ballard swept into the room. His voice rose as he vented his frustration. "These damn people. Do they not care that I represent the British government?" He walked briskly across to dump a thick wedge of paper on top of his travelling trunk before standing still, one hand on his hip, the other clasped theatrically to his head. "What's the matter, sir?" Jack asked the question dutifully. "The British government is being ignored." Ballard shook his head as if disbelieving his own words. "These damnable Frenchies are doing nothing, and I mean nothing, to assist me." "Are no wagons available, sir?" Palmer asked, deadpan. No, there are none. Nor are there any horses, or even a single damn mule." Ballard's voice kept rising. "Everything is in a state of utter chaos. The French, damn their eyes, did not bother to think what they would need. Now they are here. And lo and behold, there are not enough supplies to equip a single battalion, yet alone an entire army." Jack was not surprised by Ballard's discovery. The French army had swamped Genoa. Thousands of men had already passed through before they had arrived, and the French commissariat had stripped the town bare of anything even remotely useful. He was about to tweak Ballard's tale and remind him of these salient facts when he spied Mary studying the British major. He had not seen that particular expression on her face for nearly a decade. It was a look of appraisal, the same look she had once given a man as she assessed his worth and calculated the price he would pay for her services. "What do you think we need?" Jack was put out enough by Mary's expression to forget the need to tease his commander. "There is transport, for starters." Ballard maintained his theatrical pose, but raised his eyes to the ceiling as if searching it for inspiration. "An agent of the Crown cannot be expected to march like a common soldier. Then we will need supplies. There is no knowing what we will be able to find once we're on the move." He lowered his gaze and scowled at Jack. "The list is endless. I have no idea how we will manage." "Can you write it all down for me?" Jack greeted his master's despair with a calm smile. "Of course, but do give me some credit, Jack. I do not think they will listen to you when you ask. They will ignore you as surely as they ignored me." Jack's smile broadened. "I'm sure you're right, sir." He glanced across at Mary, who was still staring at Ballard. "But then I don't intend to be doing any asking." Ballard's eyes widened. "You mean to steal what we need?" "Yes." Ballard gave one of his own rare, wolfish smiles. "What a capital notion." Chapter 19. The 2 men and 1 boy moved quickly. They had waited until night had fallen, the near full moon casting enough light for them not to have to worry about being able to see. They had left the lodging shortly after a late supper, a light meal of bread and cheese, the best Mary had been able to provide given their straitened circumstances. Jack's stomach growled, earning him a glare from Palmer. The 3 of them were in the alley to the side of the tall townhouse where they had rented a room. Ballard had not felt the need to offer to accompany them, but he had been forced to overrule Mary, who did not want her son to join the venture. The boy had been brought up in Whitechapel. He knew how to move quietly and how to make sure the right objects ended up in the correct pockets. "Looks quiet." Jack was leading the way. He craned his neck so that he could see around the corner of the building. The street was nearly empty. With so many foreign soldiers in the town, the local population was wisely staying indoors, their windows and doors bolted tight in case their allies felt the need to fill their pockets and knapsacks before they left. "No, wait." He held up a hand, and the three of the men shrank back into the shadows, faces lowered, as a group of French non-commissioned officers sauntered past, their voices loud in the nighttime quiet. Jack let them go past. He had no idea what they would encounter on the streets now that night had fallen, but he wanted to be cautious. None of them spoke French. Any interaction with the French soldiery would be difficult and should be avoided at all costs. "All right, let's move." He led them out of the shadows, with Billy tucked behind him and Palmer bringing up the rear. They walked, quickly, their boots loud on the cobbles as they crossed the street. Palmer had suggested they head back towards the docks, so Jack led them downhill. They were not the only ones abroad. A few groups of French soldiers went by, but none gave the three of them more than a cursory glance. Still, Jack led them at a brisk pace until he spotted what they were looking for. He brought them to a halt, then turned to face Palmer. "Do you see those wagons?" He had spotted a line of them parked in a small square just off the main thoroughfare. Palmer nodded. He pushed his thumbs through the straps of his knapsack. "Let's get it done." Jack nodded. "Wait here while I check them out." There was nothing else to be said. He walked away, leaving the other two behind. As he passed the road that led towards the wagons, he spotted a single pair of sentries. They were standing together, their muskets on their shoulders as they talked. He knew they would not expect any real trouble, their presence alone enough to safeguard the supplies from their own side, or from any of the local population attempting to make off with anything. He took a moment to check no one was watching before turning and going back the way he had come. This time he saw what he wanted on the side of the square opposite the two sentries. He kept walking, his head turning from side to side as he checked for any hidden scrutiny. "You look like a bloody felon." Palmer greeted his return with a hoarse rebuke. Jack ignored the criticism. "There's an alleyway on the far side of the square. We can use that to get close." He looked at Billy. "You up for this, lad?" The boy nodded. "Course I am, Jack." Jack smiled at the bravado. He made one last check up and down the street to be certain that no one was watching the oddly matched trio. He saw nothing untoward. "Right." He grinned at the boy looking up at him. "Follow me." "My eye, what's that bloody stink?" Billy hissed the words as they crept cautiously through the dark alley Jack had spotted. "It's the bloody French." It was Palmer who replied. "Shit anywhere they will." "The dirty bastards." Jack bit back the urge to laugh. There was something in the way the boy uttered the insult that he found funny, but there was no time to enjoy it. They had reached the end of the alleyway. The wagons were just ahead. "You ready, lad?" He took Billy's shoulder before guiding him forward. Billy nodded, his lips pressed tightly together. Jack checked round swiftly, then took firm hold of the boy and hoisted him onto the back of the closest wagon. "Be quick," he whispered, before shrinking back into the shadows. Billy did not need to be told twice. Bending low, he got to work. Jack cocked an ear. He heard the gentle creak of a crate being opened. It was far too loud not to be missed. He inched out of the alley to take up a position behind the wagon. Palmer followed, the pair working together to cover both flanks. Both had the reassuring solidity of a Colt revolver pressed against their spine. They had no intention of drawing the handguns. They were amongst an allied army. If they were caught, they could hardly shoot their way free. Any scuffle would be fought the old-fashioned way, with fists and boots rather than bullets. "Here!" Jack started as Billy hissed down at him. "Stop lollygaggling and take these!" Jack snorted at the boy's quick tongue, but still reached up for the bottles he was being pressed. He recognized the feel at once. "Open your knapsack," he whispered to Palmer. "What's he found?" "Brandy." "Oh, I told you he's a good lad." Palmer held out his knapsack and Jack slipped the bottles inside. "You want more?" asked Billy, his voice too loud. "No. Shit, come on." Jack heard sounds of movement, the noise of boots coming towards them. "Get down." Billy slid down almost immediately, landing surely on his feet next to Jack. "Let's go." Jack would not push their luck. The three scuttled away, disappearing into the darkness of the alley moments before the first sentry stuck his head around the back of the wagon they had just ransacked. "You know what to get?" Jack pushed his mouth close to the boy's ear. Billy nodded. He looked up at Jack, his eyes eager. "Get it done." Jack half pushed the boy away and watched him slip through the back door of the tall townhouse before returning to where Palmer waited behind a wooden outhouse. "Is this worth it?" Palmer greeted Jack with a scowl. "I want a sword. A good one, too." Jack offered the explanation as he took up position where he could watch the house. They had discovered that a number of French officers were billeted there, and had tailed a clutch of young subalterns back to the building, surmising from their wandering gait and loud, bawdy conversations that the group had been out for an evening's drinking. The trio had waited a full hour before letting Billy loose, until Jack was reasonably certain that enough time had passed for the half-cut officers to have fallen into a stupor. "Waste of bloody effort, if you ask me." Palmer made his feelings clear. "I didn't." Palmer snorted. "You still think you're a Rupert?" He shook his head at the folly of Jack's desire. "You don't want a poker. A bundook and a bayonet, that's all a man needs in a fight." Jack noted Palmer's use of the slang for a rifle, a term used by redcoats who had served in India. It gave more clues to the man's past, as did his preference for a bayonet. "You were a redcoat, then?" "Once." "When?" "Wash the damn house." Jack did as he was told. He knew Palmer would say nothing more. The minutes dragged by. Jack stayed in the shadows and began to worry. Billy had been gone too long. "You think we should go and get him?" he hissed over his shoulder at Palmer, who had chosen to sit on the ground and leave the watching to Jack. "He'll be back. If he ain't, well, you were the dolt who wanted a bloody poker." Jack bit his tongue. He turned back to resume his vigil and found himself staring into Billy's glowing face. "Where the hell did you come from?" He had not heard the boy approach. "Where do you think?" Billy came close, his arms full. "Here you go." He pressed a sword into Jack's gut. "Good enough for you?" Jack grasped the sword in both hands. It had the curve of a sabre, and it was reassuringly heavy. "You little bugger, that's perfect." The boy held something else out. "You might want these too." Jack took the second object clumsily, the sword still in his hands. He recognized the feel of the leather carrying case instantly. "Blow me time." "Thought you'd like them." Billy beamed. "So, what next?" Jack laughed quietly. Mary's son had provided him with a new sword and a pair of field glasses. He glanced up at the sky. It was starting to get lighter. They had dealt with the priorities, but they still had to get the things on Ballard's list. He cocked an ear as he heard a sound that would do the job nicely. He turned to Palmer. "You hear that?" "Aye," the larger man replied, then slowly eased himself to his feet. "It came from just over yonder." He nodded towards the shadowy buildings at the rear of the yard behind the officer's lodging. "Shall we take it?" Billy asked the question, his eagerness obvious. "Oh, yes." Palmer smiled at his companions. "That'll suit the Major very nicely indeed." The mule was noisy, too noisy, and it clearly objected to the two strangers who bustled around it, piling on sacks and panniers from the wagon left outside the stable.
"Look alive-o! We don't have long," admonished Billy, who was on lookout whilst Jack and Palmer loaded up the mule.
"Hush yourself," snapped Jack, then had to snatch his arm away from the mule, which had just tried to bite him. He moved away quickly to grab another sack, which smelled like it contained cheese. The pile they were quickly depleting must have comprised the officer's private stash of provisions. Jack felt no compassion for them. The men under their command would enjoy no such treats. Now, neither would the officers.
"Qui vive?"
Jack stopped in his tracks. A heavy sack that he guessed contained flour in his arms.
"C'est vous, Maxime?"
Again the voice came. Jack did not understand the words, but he knew they were in trouble.
"Frenchies!"
Billy called out a belated warning. Shit. Jack bundled the sack he was holding onto the back of the mule, balancing it precariously on one of the already bulging panniers.
"Leave them to me."
Palmer strode outside. Billy rushed to Jack's side, his voice breathless with excitement.
"Will Mr. Palmer fight them?"
"Shut your muzzle." Jack pushed the eager boy to one side, then reached for the mule's tether. As he untied it, he heard loud voices outside, a flurry of fast French greeting Palmer's appearance.
"Come on, lad. Hold this and come with me."
Billy grabbed hold of the tether. Together they hauled the mule's head around, ignoring the loud braying that announced the animal's protest to the world.
"Come on,"
urged Jack, pulling hard. Finally, the reluctant animal started to move. They emerged from the stable to see Palmer standing in front of 3 dishevelled French officers, roused from sleep by the noises coming from behind their lodging.
"Mais qu'est-ce que tu fais, bordel?"
The shortest of the 3 Frenchmen strode towards Palmer, gesticulating wildly. Palmer ignored him. Instead, he looked over his shoulder at Jack and Billy, who were dragging the mule and its load towards the side passage of the house.
"You boys ready?"
It was getting brighter, the approach of dawn lightening the sky. Jack saw Palmer's face crease into a smile as he posed the question.
"Hit him, Mr. Palmer!"
Billy sang out before Jack could reply. Palmer's smile broadened at the high-pitched command. He turned on his heel to see the Frenchman close behind him, his mouth spewing out a tirade of protest at being ignored.
"Oh, shut your mewling,"
bellowed Palmer, his deep voice cutting the Frenchman off. He gave him no time to gather his thoughts. His fist moved fast, hitting the officer full in the mouth.
"Shit."
Jack muttered the word under his breath before turning back to the mule and pulling hard on the lead rope, forcing the animal to pick up the pace.
"Hit him, Mr. Palmer! Hit him!"
Billy bounced against Jack's side, his eyes riveted on Ballard's bodyguard. The Frenchman sat on his backside, his hand raised to his mouth. Blood seeped through his fingers to drip down the front of his white shirt. His companions glanced at each other, and the first went for Palmer, his fists flailing towards the taller man's head. Palmer saw him coming and had time to laugh before he ducked away, dodging under the blows before coming up punching. His fists pounded the Frenchman's gut, one after the other, a series of 6 blows coming so fast the French officer could do nothing but absorb them before his feet gave way beneath him. He fell back, hitting the ground hard before curling into a ball around his battered stomach.
"Get on now, Jack."
Palmer snapped the command, his breathing unaltered. Jack did not need to be told twice. He was forcing the pace and had managed to get the mule into something that resembled a trot. He glanced back just in time to see Palmer turn to face the remaining Frenchman, his fists lifting into a fighting stance. The last Frenchman was less keen to fight. His head whipped around as he searched for a weapon.
"Come on now, monsieur,"
Palmer took a step towards him. "Let's get it over with, shall we?" The Frenchman made a desperate grab for a shovel left propped against the wall of the outhouse. "Oh, we can do it that way if you like." Palmer took another pace forward. Jack reached the side of the house, losing sight of Palmer as he and Billy made for the main road to the front of the officer's lodging. "Wait!" Billy screeched in protest, desperate to witness the fight about to take place. "Shut up!" Jack had no intention of waiting. He had the mule moving, and he knew that if they stopped, they would have the devil's own job getting it going again. As they emerged from the passage, he pulled the animal's head around, aiming it in the direction of their own lodging. "Come on, you bastard!" The animal fought against their control, and Jack's boots skidded on the ground as he wrestled the beast after him. He just about had them going in the right direction when Palmer jogged out of the passageway, his head turning quickly from side to side before he spotted them. He ran over to them, his face bearing the slightest hint of a flush. "Did you get him, Mr. Palmer? Did you knock him down?" Billy dropped the lead rope as he ran towards Palmer. "Come on, lad. No time for that now." Palmer lowered a heavy arm around the boy and pushed him forward. He trotted alongside the mule and flashed Jack a smile before slapping the animal hard on the flank. The mule responded by immediately charging forward. Jack stumbled and nearly lost his footing at the rapid increase in pace. Palmer laughed at the sight before easing himself into a run to keep up with the beast. The two men, one boy and a single mule pounded through the quiet streets in the last of the night. They had all they needed. Chapter 20. Navarra, June 1859. The tricolours were bright in the late afternoon sunshine as the tired French column marched into Navarra. To the dusty and footsore soldiers, it appeared that every inhabitant of the town had turned out to wave a flag in greeting. The huge crowd welcomed them with enthusiasm, their cheers and shouts accompanying the orchestra set up in the town square, which was blasting out Partons pour la Syrie, Napoleon's favoured choice of national anthem. Jack grimaced as he forced away a plump, middle-aged woman who had grabbed his cheeks before trying to kiss him full on the lips. She laughed, her mouth opening wide to cheer even as she stumbled backwards. Ballard's little party marched in between two regiments of chasseurs, their single mule led by Billy, who had declared himself the animal's owner. They were all suffering from the heat and the dust. The long days of marching made all the more miserable by constant delays that left them exposed to the relentless sun for hour upon hour. "Go away!" Jack used his palm to push away a young boy trying to hug his legs. He turned to Ballard. "This is madness." The Major marched at Jack's right. With Palmer on his other side, he was being spared much of the crowd's attention. "It is a good madness, Jack. Do not be such a sourpuss." Jack only managed to growl in reply. The crowd's cheers doubled as they spotted a body of cavalry arriving behind the chasseurs. Jack did not think he had ever seen so many people in one place. A crowd dozens deep lined the streets. Every window was open, and townsfolk leaned out to wave their tricolours and halloo the troops marching below. The grander houses sported balconies, on which hordes of better-dressed citizens gathered, their cheers and waves no less enthusiastic than those coming from the dirtiest rascals cavorting in the gutters. The women tossed down rose petals, showering the heads of the crowd and the soldiers alike, their daughters blowing kisses to the more handsome in the ranks, their laughter unaffected by the ribald suggestions shouted back their way. Another stout matron stepped forward. She collided with Jack, pressing against his arm before succeeding in planting a wet kiss on his cheek. She tried to reach Ballard, but Jack fended her away. He watched her carefully as she pirouetted to one side, a small tricolour brandished over her head like a trophy. The column's pace had slowed to barely a crawl. The French soldiers were enjoying their role in the spectacle, and to a man they played to the crowd. Many raised their kepis on the barrels of their rifles, holding them high over the heads of the marching column. The locals thronged around them, the men grabbing hands whilst the women kissed any they could reach. "Do try to enjoy yourself, Jack." Ballard was forced to lean close so that his words could be heard over the tumult. "I fancy it is not often a soldier is greeted thus." Jack was tempted to forcibly switch places with his commander and see how the major liked the attention. The idea died as the column came to a complete halt. "For God's—" His curse was cut off as yet another woman came at him. He lifted a hand to push her away, but she was too quick and slipped into his arms before he could fend her off. She nuzzled against him, her face and hair pressing against his neck, her lithe body writhing against his hip. He slipped his arm around her waist and held her close. She smelled of soap and rosewater, and with his hand circled round her hip, he could tell that she was slim. Encouraged, he risked a glance at her face. She was pretty, with dark brown eyes that sparkled as she cheered loudly in his ear. She laughed as she saw him looking at her, her head thrown back to reveal a long, slender neck. "Now you like it better, I fancy," Ballard shouted gleefully as he saw Jack entwined with his attractive admirer. Jack said nothing. It had been a long time since he had held a girl. The crowd was now pressing forward to engulf the stationary column. His companion reached down to take hold of his hands. She pulled him from Ballard's side, and he could do nothing but go with her. The gap was immediately filled with more well-wishers. Jack could not help laughing as an older woman swept in and grabbed Ballard's cheeks before planting a series of loud kisses across them. The girl laughed with him, then pressed her own face forward, kissing him lingeringly on the lips. Her eyes were open, and she laughed as she pulled away, her cheeks tinted pink at what she saw reflected in his gaze. She backed away, pulling Jack after her, easing him through the crowd. He went with her, the life in her eyes captivating him. She leaned forward to kiss him again before twisting away to haul him into the depths of the throng. Jack tried to glance at his companions. Ballard and Palmer were both surrounded, and a stout matron was smothering Billy. Mary was at the boy's side. Someone had planted a flower in her hair, and she was laughing as a man kissed her hand. Jack lost sight of them as his companion tugged him after her. They were in the thick of the crowd now. Men and women clapped him on the back or tried to kiss his face, and he was buffeted from side to side as his partner cavorted in front of him. Eventually she found a space large enough to dance in. Those around them whooped with delight as they saw what she intended, many starting to clap and sing in encouragement. Jack gave up any notion of fighting free and let himself be led into the dance. He would do what Ballard had suggested and try to enjoy himself. "Wipe that smirk off your face, if you please, Jack," Ballard snapped the moment Jack approached the small fire that would warm their camp that night. He did his best to obey, hiding his face from his commander. Night was falling. Ballard and the others had not gone far. The column had taken several hours to clear Navarra, and they would be spending the night in a field only half a mile from the town. "Did you not enjoy the celebrations?" Jack could not resist the jibe. "No, I did not." Ballard was waspish. "It was a trial, and one made all the harder by your absence." "You told me to enjoy it." "I did not mean by yourself. I did not bring you all this way to abandon me." "I did not abandon you." Jack sat down on the ground opposite Ballard, their meagre fire between them. Palmer was off to one side, busying himself with a jug of beer that had been given to him by the good citizens of Nevada. He seemed content to leave Jack and Ballard to their conversation, but Jack was sure that he would have at least one ear on what was said. Mary and Billy were curled up together under a blanket a few yards away, exhausted by the day. "So whilst you were cavorting with that local girl—" "I wasn't cavorting with her," Jack interrupted his commander. His time with the girl had been rather enjoyable, but it had come to an end rather abruptly when her father had arrived to reclaim her. There had not been time for anything untoward to occur, but for the first time in a long while he had been tempted by a woman. He shook the notion away. That was a complication he did not need. He had spent the next few hours trying to get back to his party. It had been a tiresome experience, but he had no intention of admitting that to Ballard. "Did you hear what I just said?" Jack focused his attention back on the Major, who was staring at him across the fire. The flames lit his face with an orange glow that flickered across his features and cast his eyes into shadow. "I'm sorry." He offered a rueful half-smile. "Do you mind repeating it for me?" Ballard shook his head slowly. "I give you news of the greatest import, yet your mind dwells on some skinny girl who dared to give you a kiss." "She wasn't all that skinny." He might only have danced with her, but he had been left in no doubt as to what curves had been hidden under her thin summer dress. "So, what news?" Ballard's lips pursed. "I am of a half mind not to tell you." "I apologize, sir." Jack tried to sound contrite. "I'm all ears, I promise." "Very well." Ballard needed no further urging. "The Sardinians have won the first battle of the campaign." Jack laughed, thinking he was being mocked. He caught a glimpse of Ballard's face in the firelight, and it was enough to stop the laughter. "You're serious?" "I am always serious, Jack. I would have thought you had learned that much by now." Ballard's finger lifted to toy with his moustache. "Vittorio Emanuele may not need Napoleon's assistance after all. If what I hear is correct, the Austrians have been repulsed by a Sardinian attack. There are even tales of Vittorio himself fighting in the front line." Jack gave a single grunt in response. "So it was a big battle, then?" "So they claim. But the Sardinians would claim a dancing master wrestling with a stray dog to be a pitched battle, so we should not believe all I have been told. Whatever the facts, it is clear that the Austrians are dithering. I confess I cannot think why. They should be pressing home the advantage of their numbers whilst the Allied army is still disjointed. If they let the French and the Sardinians combine, they will have made their task twice as difficult." Jack was listening carefully now. He understood Ballard's point. Together, the French and Sardinian armies would be more than a match for the Austrian force. If the Austrians had any nous, they would throw everything they had at the Sardinians before the French arrived. He shook his head as he considered their folly. They're making Napoleon's task too easy. Once the armies are joined together, he can go on the offensive. Ballard offered one of his rare smiles. "He is thinking bigger." Jack scowled. As ever, Ballard was withholding some of the information he had discovered. "Go on." "Orders to march have already been given. The French are being bold. Napoleon has decided upon a flank march directly across the face of the enemy." Ballard looked across to check that he had Jack's full attention. "Come closer so I can explain." Jack did as he was bid, and shuffled around the fire so that he sat next to his commander. "We are here." Ballard used a finger to draw a circle in the dusty soil. "The enemy is spread across their lines of communication, but the bulk of their force is here." He drew a second circle to the right and slightly above the first. "The Sardinians are above us here, A third circle was drawn above the first and to the left of the one that denoted the Austrian force. "If I understand correctly, the French are going to change the direction of their march and swing up and around to join the Sardinians in their current position." He drew a line to join the two Allied forces. Jack frowned. He saw the plan immediately. It was as bold as Ballard had claimed. The French army would march northwards, directly across the front of the enemy forces. It would allow the two Allied armies to combine whilst changing the direction of their attack. But it was full of risk. If the Austrians knew what was happening, all they had to do was advance and strike the French in the flank. It's a hell of a risk. That march will take days, if not a full week. Jack had seen the danger to the French army's open right flank. Moving an army was a slow business. The Austrians would have men keeping them in touch with both Allied forces. They could not fail to see what was developing right in front of them. They would have plenty of time to organise their attack. Ballard was slowly shaking his head. "There is 96 kilometres of railway line running from Voghera to Vercelli." He drew two small circles between the two Allied armies. "A march that would have taken 4 to 5 days can now be done in just one." He raised an eyebrow. "The world has changed, Jack. This is the modern age." He slapped one hand into the palm of the other. "We must grasp the potential that all these wonderful advances have presented to us." Jack heard the change in Ballard's tone. He was clearly impressed by the thinking of the French commanders. Their flank is still open. By the time the dullards in the Austrian High Command see the opportunity, it will be past. Ballard leaned forward. "This is modern war. Napoleon has grasped that fact, the Austrians have not. The Sardinians will launch a diversionary attack in the north, which should keep the enemy guessing for long enough for the French to move." He shook his head before looking Jack firmly in the eye. "The Austrians' timidity invites such a move, and I am pleased to say that we shall have the opportunity to see just how this hand plays out. I have found us a place." Jack held Ballard's gaze. "Where?" "With General McMahon. He commands 2nd Corps." "A corps commander? Is that all? I would have supposed you would want to be with Napoleon himself." "I thought you would prefer to be closer to the action." Jack saw a flicker of unease in Ballard's eyes. It was hard to read his expression, especially in the firelight, but he had an inkling that the Major was holding something back. "You're not telling me everything." "Why do you say that?" Ballard scowled. "I know you." Jack had spotted the way Ballard's eyes narrowed as he absorbed the accusation. "We're not just here to observe. You would never have accepted a place with a mere corps commander unless you had reasons for doing so." "It was all I could get." Jack snorted. "You're a terrible liar. You would know." Ballard looked away and stared into the flames. The silence stretched thin. Jack let it build, certain that it would defeat Ballard more surely than any argument he could concoct. He did not have to wait long to be proven correct. "I suppose I should tell you." Ballard glanced across at Palmer, who returned his stare as calmly as ever. "You are correct, Jack." He looked at Jack as he made his confession. "There is something else we are here to do." "You devious bastard, I knew it!" Jack could not hold back the comment. He considered the interplay between Ballard and his bodyguard. "Palmer knows this already, I take it?" Ballard nodded. "You couldn't trust me?" "It's not a matter of trust, Jack. I would trust you with my life, I think you know that. But not with this, whatever it is. There was no value in you knowing." "So what's changed?" Jack searched Ballard's face for the truth. He did not know if he would ever find it. "We are close now. You will need to know what you are looking for." Ballard paused, then offered a tight-lipped smile. "Who you are looking for?" Jack heard the confession being made. "I see. So we came all this way to find someone." Ballard nodded. "A young man whose father is keen for him to return home." "What's he doing here?" "The young man in question fancies himself as something of an adventurer. He ran away from home to join the French forces. Now he is here, but his father wants him back." Jack absorbed the facts. "This lad's father, he must be someone important if he's willing to bankroll us." "He's a man of means, yes. I cannot reveal his identity to you, but I shall say that I trust his judgment completely." "And here you are, ready to do his bidding." Jack's first instinct was to mock. "Do you not approve?" Ballard's eyes narrowed at the comment, yet he answered pleasantly enough. Jack considered the question. "No, I don't think I do. But I doubt either you or this rich old bastard, whoever he is, would think to ask my opinion." He laughed at his own pomposity, then looked across to see Palmer's reaction. But the older man's face was carved from granite and gave nothing away. He thought on Ballard's announcement. "It's all rather convenient." He was thinking and talking at the same time. "You being in the right place and all. I take it that this man we're after is in McMahon's division." "Yes." "A coincidence?" "Please, Jack." Ballard pouted at the very idea. "Do you really think I would rely on chance?" "So this has all been arranged?" "Of course. Nothing happens by chance. Do you see that now? It's all part of a design." He stared at Jack. "My design." "I see." Jack tried not to let Ballard detect how impressed he was. He should have known that the Major would have had everything planned down to the last detail. "So, what are we to do?" He asked the only question that seemed relevant. "When we find this young miscreant?" "It's very simple." Ballard appeared to try to find another smile. He failed, and his expression looked much closer to a grimace than anything warmer. "When we find him, we have only one course of action." He looked Jack straight in the eye. "We kidnap him." Chapter 21. The day was the hottest yet. The line of march was littered with fallen treasures, the French soldiers abandoning the souvenirs they had brought with them from Navarre. Jack scanned the debris. He saw nothing of value, at least not in military terms. The French army might have dumped anything that weighed them down, but they were not discarding any of their equipment. Their discipline was holding, even as they attempted to steal a march on their enemy. The train ride from Voghera to Vercelli had taken Ballard's small party the best part of a whole day and half a night. It had been slower than anticipated, but they had still travelled the 96 miles in less time than even the fastest forced march. There had been no sign of the Austrians, even when they left Vercelli far behind and set out again on foot, their single mule still their only form of transport. They had been on the road since dawn, marching in the dust of the troops ahead, and stopping only for an hour when the sun was at its height. Now the afternoon was drawing to a close, and the cooler air of evening was providing a welcome respite. The march had given Jack time to think on Ballard's mission. He examined his feelings to see if he liked the sound of this boy they had come so far to find. The lad had thrown off the shackles of his old life and found himself a new one that his family clearly did not approve of. In that way, this young rebel was very much like Jack himself. But Jack had embarked on his first charade out of desperation, his future bleak and without much in the way of hope. This boy's life was different. It would have been one of privilege and ease, 1,000 options his for the taking. He had spurned such advantage, and to Jack's mind that made him just another callow fool with more money than sense. "You look like you need a good shit." Jack grunted as Palmer aimed the barb. They were walking side by side at the head of their little column. The regiment in front had fallen out of the line of march, but Ballard had ordered his party to continue, the French soldiers' rest allowing the small group to march on without breathing in the persistent cloud of dust kicked up by their boots. It was not hard to agree with the decision, and the long, dreary trudge had been dramatically improved by their being able to breathe without choking. "What do you reckon about this mission of ours?" Palmer did not answer. His gaze was fixed on the scenery. The countryside they were passing through was lush and green, the rolling fields stretching away as far as the eye could see. "Do you mind?" Jack broke the silence. He wanted Palmer's opinion. "Do I mind what, exactly?" "Coming all this way for some little shit who has about as much sense as a dead sparrow." Palmer grunted at Jack's choice of words. "No." "Truly? So you agree that it's worth this effort just to bring this posh boy home?" Palmer's eyebrows knitted together. "Mr. Ballard thinks it is. That's good enough for me." "That's it?" Jack shook his head at the dull answer. "Ballard says do it, so that's enough." He looked over his shoulder. Ballard was walking behind Billy and the mule. He was deep in conversation with Mary and would not overhear them. "Aye, it's enough for me." Palmer returned his gaze to the fields on either side of the lane they were tramping along. It was narrower than the main road they had followed for much of the day, its course meandering down the side of a hill towards a thin copse of trees. "What a loyal fellow you are." Jack tried to get a rise out of Palmer. He had never had such blind faith, not even when he was a raw recruit finding his way in the Queen's army. Such independent spirit had cost him, but he could not deny that part of his character. His holdover must be pretty damn strong to have secured such devotion. Palmer glared at Jack for a moment before looking away, his expression guarded. "You ask too many questions." He made a play of glancing around them. "Now I've got one for you." "What is it?" "Where the fuck are we?" Jack copied Palmer in scanning their surroundings. He saw no one and nothing, save for mile upon mile of empty countryside. They had been marching in the midst of an entire army, yet it appeared they had managed to get lost. "Shit." He ambled to a halt. "Shit indeed," Palmer agreed. "We must have taken a wrong turn when we left those Frenchies." "Oh, we'll have to go back. We can't have gone that far." Jack turned and waited for Ballard to catch up. "What is it?" Ballard called as he came closer. "We took a wrong turn," Jack answered. "And how did we do that?" Ballard was clearly not impressed. "It was Palmer's fault. He hasn't stopped talking since we left those French chasseurs. He didn't see the turn." Jack tried to make light of the situation. Ballard gave a derisive snort. "There appears to be a hamlet ahead. Perhaps we will be able to find someone there who can do a better job of guiding us. You two walk ahead and see what is what. I'll follow with the others." Jack nodded in acknowledgement of the order. He could just about make out the top of the buildings Ballard had spotted. The hamlet was half hidden behind the copse of cypress trees they had been walking towards. On its far side, the ground sloped down sharply so that only a handful of red-tiled rooftops were visible. As far as he could make out, there could be no more than a couple of dozen dwellings at most. As the two of them started to walk again, he felt an odd sensation, as though a cold hand had just brushed against the hairs on the back of his neck. It was late afternoon, and all was quiet. The only sound, other than their boots and the hooves of the mule, the birdsong coming from the trees. Yet as they moved into the group of trees that straddled the lane, he began to feel uneasy. The air grew cooler as the two men walked through the copse. Jack could smell the trees now they were underneath their canopy, the damp odour of a wood in summer. The feeling of unease was growing. He held out an arm and stopped Palmer in his tracks, then closed his eyes as he strained his hearing. "What is it?" Jack lifted a single finger to hush Palmer. He listened for a moment more, then opened his eyes once again. "It's too quiet." Palmer said nothing, neither agreeing nor disagreeing with the observation, but he stood still and allowed Jack to listen. The rest of the party came into the shadow of the trees. "What is it now?" Ballard was close enough to snap the question. Jack gave up his attempt to hear something. "We need to get off the road." Ballard scowled. "Why would we do that? I do not hear anything." "Then listen." "Come on now, Jack. This is not the time. It's been a long day." "Be quiet, all of you. He's listening." It was Mary who came to Jack's aid. "He knows what he's about. You carry on, Jack." Jack caught her eye, but it was not the time to dwell on her support, even if it was the nicest thing she had said to him in weeks. "Well, do you hear something or not?" Ballard fired off the question after a moment's pause, his voice tetchy. "We can hardly stand here all day." "Hush." This time Jack was sure there had been something. He raised a finger to silence any more questions, holding his breath as he tried to focus on the sound. It did not take long for him to know what he heard. "Off the road! Now!" He hissed the command, then walked quickly to take the mule's lead rein out of Billy's hand. The animal brayed loudly in protest as he hauled it off the lane and deeper into the trees. "Keep this bloody thing quiet," he snapped as he handed the reins back to Billy, who was looking up at him with wide, excited eyes. "What is it, Jack?" The boy was eager to know what had spooked him. "Hush. Stay here. Look after your ma." He turned to make sure the others had obeyed. "Sir, stay here. I'll go ahead." He looked at Palmer. "You had better stay too." "Well, can't I come with you, Jack?" Billy made his plea quickly. "No." Ballard was quick to take charge. "Jack, I'll follow you. Palmer will stay here." He glanced sharply at Billy. "As will you, William." He looked back at Jack. "What did you hear?" Jack offered a thin smile. "Horses. Lots of them. And I wager they don't belong to the frogs." Jack lay on the ground. It was damp, the undergrowth at the edge of the copse spongy beneath his chest. He had moved quickly through the last of the trees before going down on his belly to worm his way into the dense tangle of foliage at the copse's edge. He had chosen his spot with care, giving himself a clear view out of the trees while still being half hidden from view. The ground sloped away sharply. The lane they had been following meandered downhill in a series of gentle curves towards the small hamlet that Ballard had spotted. It was not much of a place. The buildings that lined the lane were simple peasant houses interspersed with barns and outhouses. Most were made of stone, with small windows and wooden shutters, and none was of a size or grandeur to imply that anyone other than the local farm workers lived there. Jack eased himself into position, then pulled his field glasses from their leather case. The brass was cool in his hands as he readied them for use. He knew he owed Billy a coin or two for having the sense and the deft fingers to steal them for him. The hamlet was quiet. He pressed the glasses to his eyes and panned slowly across the buildings. He saw no one. The silence pressed around him. Even the birds had gone quiet. The only sound the noise of branches and foliage moving in the gentle breeze wafting across the higher ground. He focused on one of the larger houses near the centre of the village. He frowned. The shutters were closed, something that he found odd. It was late in the afternoon, the time for men to be returning from work in the fields and for their womenfolk to be greeting them with food and drink. Instead, he saw nothing and no one. The sound he had heard earlier returned. It was louder, and this time he had no doubt what it was. He swung the glasses towards the far edge of the village. He saw what he expected to find almost immediately. The Austrian cavalrymen were in no hurry. They entered the village at a gentle trot, their sabres sheathed. Clearly they were not expecting trouble, even this far from their own lines. Jack supposed they were a lightly armed patrol, the kind sent out far from the main body of the army to discover the location of the enemy forces. They were dressed as hussars, their uniform not dissimilar from that of the 15th Hussars that Major Ballard wore. But where Ballard's was dark blue, the Austrians' tunics were sky blue with a green-faced shako with matching plume. He kept his eyes on the cavalrymen as they rode into the village. They were close enough now for him to be able to pick out their voices and hear their laughter. They slowed their pace to a walk before coming to a full halt. He could make out the individual words as their leader gave the order to dismount. He did not understand what was said, but it was clear they intended to stay a while. The Austrian commander's voice was not the only thing he heard. He lowered his field glasses, then eased to one side so that he could look behind him. It sounded like a whole company of skirmishers was coming towards him, the noise of boots thrashing through the undergrowth loud enough to drown out the orders being shouted by the Austrians. "For God's sake, keep it down!" he hissed. Ballard emerged from the last of the trees. "What can you see?" Jack winced at his commander's loud voice. "Get down before they see you." "Who will see me?" Ballard finally matched Jack's hushed tone. He crouched low, then scurried forward before dropping to the ground at his side. "Austrian light cavalry. Probably just a patrol meant to establish where the French outposts are." Jack gave the description in clipped, quiet tones. "May I?" Ballard held out his hand. Jack handed over his field glasses, then waited as Ballard made his own study of the enemy troops. "Fine work, Jack." Ballard finished his inspection quickly, then handed the glasses back. "I knew I was right to bring you, even if it is your fault we are here in the first place." The Major's brow furrowed as he came to a decision. "Well, we are lost, so perhaps they are too. Whichever it may be, I think our decision is clear. We will go back the way we came. There is no sense getting involved with these fellows." Jack nodded. He was in full agreement. Their party were ostensibly neutrals, but he did not want to explain the niceties of their presence to a group of Austrian cavalrymen. Then, the first scream shattered the quiet. The sound undulated, overly loud in the still afternoon air. It was a dreadful noise, a banshee wail of horror that had no place being there. Jack froze. The scream echoed through the buildings, rising in pitch before being shut off abruptly. The quiet pressed back over them. It was as if the sound had never been, the scream a product of their imagination. He scanned the hamlet with his field glasses, searching for the source of the unholy noise. he saw nothing. The Austrians had dismounted. He saw several of them walking easily down the hamlet's single lane. Some carried carbines, the shorter version of an infantryman's rifle. As he watched, a pair of them approached the door to one of the houses. They did not stop to knock, but simply battered it open with a combination of carbine stocks and boots. The door burst back on its hinges and they plunged inside, their carbines held ready to counter anyone who stood against them. The bastards! He hissed the oath under his breath, then pulled the field glasses from his face. He had seen enough. Another scream came. It was as dreadful as the first, but shorter. The sound cut off before it reached its crescendo. He looked up and saw Ballard watching him closely. "What is happening?" The Major spoke softly. Jack was saved from giving a reply by the sound of a commotion. He raised the glasses to his face in time to see a young girl burst out of a house and tear down the lane as if the very hounds of hell were on her trail. She was the first local he had seen, and he tracked her instinctively, his breath catching in his throat as he recognized her fear. The girl ran hard, her skirts bunched in one hand. He caught the bright flash of a pale ankle as she tried to escape the two men who ran after her, their shouts of anger loud. She never stood a chance. She was running as fast as she could, but her pursuers were quicker. They caught her as she turned to run down the lane that led to the copse where Jack and Ballard lay watching. One of the Austrian cavalrymen slapped the girl hard, the sound of the impact like a distant gunshot. Still she tried to get away. Jack saw her writhe back and forth in an attempt to free herself from their clutches. She was slapped again for her trouble, whilst the other man danced around her before darting forward to tear away her skirt. For a moment Jack thought they would take her there and then. The fight had left the girl, and she did not resist as the men started to drag her away, their intent obvious. A local man came out of the closest house. His shouts carried clearly to the British agents. He carried a long knife, the kind a peasant would use to carve bread or any haunches of meat that came his way. The Austrian holding the girl laughed away the interruption, before barking an instruction at his comrade, who immediately slipped his carbine from his shoulder. The local cared nothing for the threat. He ran towards the pair of Austrian cavalrymen, bellowing in fury. Even from a distance Jack heard the desperate anger in his voice, his horror at bearing witness to the girl's torment obvious. He was still shouting when the closer of the two Austrians shot him. Jack lowered the field glasses. Ballard was staring directly at him. There was a warning in his eyes. Jack met the gaze evenly. He tried to deny the emotions that had been surging through his veins since the moment he had seen the girl attempt her desperate flight. The cowardly curs. Ballard spoke softly, clearly appalled by what he was seeing. They are soldiers. Still Jack said nothing. He forced his breathing to slow, to counter the urge to act. He tried to convince himself that he had seen nothing more than the reflection of his nightmares. It was not his fight. The girl was not his concern. Her honour and her soul not his to protect. The scream came again. It was louder than before. It rose higher, the pitch pushing to a crescendo that went on and on, the sound wavering but left to echo through the silent hamlet. "Jack?" Ballard's voice quivered with emotion. "It is a shameful thing. It is despicable that soldiers would act in this way." He paused to make sure he had Jack's full attention, speaking slowly and clearly. "But we have a job to do. Do not put that in jeopardy." Jack kept his gaze riveted on Ballard's face. His eyes locked onto the coldness he saw reflected in the other man's stare. He was up and running before the scream ended. Chapter 22. Jack's breath echoed in his ears. It was all he could hear as he ran. Everything was focused on what was to come, on what he would unleash on the men who brought war to the innocent. The ground flashed past under his boots, yards disappearing in seconds. He freed his weapons as he pounded on, the hilt of his stolen sabre snug in his right hand, the Colt revolver solid and sure in his left. The girl had been dragged from sight, so he concentrated his attention on the nearest house, his body thrilling with the promise of the violence to come. It was time to be who he was meant to be. He hit the first door hard and went in fast. It took no more than a single heartbeat for his eyes to adjust to the gloomy interior. An Austrian cavalryman came staggering out of a rear room, his arms filled with a heavy sack of flour. Jack saw surprise register on the man's face before the sabre took him down. The soldier hit the floor face down, his body thumping onto the sack, which burst on impact, filling the air with an explosion of white dust. He lay where he fell, his blood turning the spilled flour to red paste. Jack felt nothing. He was already turning away, gore dripping from the sabre. Outside he paused, glancing from side to side for no longer than a second before he was moving again. He ran hard, bounding over a low wall as he made for the place he had seen the Austrians leave their horses. 2 of their number came out of a house 20 yards to his front. They took one look at him before they dropped their haul of earthenware jugs and drew their swords. He ran straight at them. He did not think of the odds or of the risk to his blackened soul. He paid no attention to the sound of breaking pottery as the jugs smashed, their precious liquid spilling to darken the dusty soil. The 2 Austrians were no raw recruits. They came at him with measured purpose, moving apart, clearing room for their sword arms as they prepared to cut down the blood-splattered madman charging towards them. Jack saw their intent and skidded to a halt, his boots scrabbling for purchase. He spotted the flicker of alarm on the 2 faces, now no more than 10 yards away. There was time for the hint of a smile before he covered the first face with the barrel of his revolver. The gun roared. The first Austrian crumpled as the bullet tore into his chest. He fell without a sound, his body seeming to roll over itself as it tumbled forward. The second man bellowed, raising the alarm, before the Colt's second bullet took him in the centre of his face. Jack lurched back into motion, his eyes roving across the silent houses, searching for the one where the 2 Austrians had taken the girl. A door to his right opened. He saw the frightened face of a young Austrian cavalryman roused by his companion's shout. It was not one of the men Jack was searching for, so he turned and vaulted over a low stone wall that ran alongside the lane. Voices chased after him. More cavalrymen emerged to shout an alarm as they spotted the man who had come amongst them. He ignored them and kept moving, instinct driving him onwards. Another door swung open. A man stepped outside, the sword in his hand incongruous against his naked legs. Jack recognized him in an instant. The Austrian saw him coming. Unlike his comrades, he did not seek a fight. Instead, he twisted away, making a grab for the door handle. Jack knew what was intended. He forced his legs to work harder, straining for every last scrap of speed. 3 paces on and he knew he would not make it. The door was already moving, the Austrian's face twisted with sudden fear as he tried to slam it shut. Jack raised his revolver, his left arm braced. He fired as he ran. The first bullet chewed a thick splinter of wood an inch away from the Austrian's hand. The second hit the ancient wood half an inch below the first. The third took the Austrian in the throat. Jack shouted then. the first sound he had made since he had left Ballard. He released the madness, the joy of rediscovering his bitter talent. He was aware that other men were chasing after him, but he paid them no heed. He thought only of the girl he raced to save. The man he had shot blocked the doorway. The door pressed hard against his bare legs. His shirt had rucked up as he fell, revealing his private parts. Jack barely noticed them as he leapt over the body and into the gloomy interior. A sword came at him out of the darkness. He did not know what saved him. Instincts buried deep unleashed a parry that blocked the blade an instant before it sliced into his neck. His eyes adjusted to the gloom, and he located his assailant before the sword came at him again. This time, the parry was easy. He swatted the blade aside, then countered with a strike of his own. He felt nothing as it was knocked away. It was simple to sway back, then let the inevitable counter flash past his chest. He held back his next stroke, instead twisting away from the door. He did not want the open entrance at his back, the men coming after him sure to be only too willing to slide a blade into his unprotected spine. It was as he moved that he saw the other bodies in the room. One was dead, a gaping chasm where a throat had been. He was an old man, his grey beard now blackened with blood. The second body was very much alive. The girl he had watched being taken away was sliding backwards on the floor, the tattered remains of her dress clutched around her. He caught a glimpse of her naked chest, but her lower clothes appeared intact, and his heart sang as he realized he had arrived in time. "Come on, then!" He fanned the flames of his own fury. The sight of the abused girl spurred him on, and he attacked the enemy soldier, his stolen sabre moving fast. The sword blurred through the air, flowing through the blows, one coming after the other without thought. The Austrian whimpered as he fought, a cry escaping his lips every time he managed to block another attack. Jack began to laugh. He taunted the Austrian, his superiority revealed with every hammering blow he struck. He was still laughing as he knocked the man's sword wide, then stepped forward and punched his sabre into the man's chest, pushing his weight behind it, driving the blade deep. He came close to the man he was killing, his face no more than an inch from the Austrian's nose. He sneered as the would-be rapist died in front of him, the feel of his blood hot and sticky on his hands. He did not shirk from the horror he saw reflected in his opponent's eyes, the final glimmer of terror unleashed. Then, with a great roar, he threw the man away, forcing the corpse from his blade and freeing it ready for the fight he knew was still to come. The door was yanked open. The rest of the cavalrymen had arrived. Jack lifted his left hand. He fired his last bullet, the shot catching the arm of the first man through the door. He let the gun fall from his hand, then attacked with his sabre, his first desperate blow forcing the wounded man to take a step backwards. He snarled as he fought now, his sabre battering away the wounded Austrian's weak counterstroke. The man did not try again. Instead, he slipped to one side, making space for a second cavalryman to step forward. Jack cared nothing for the new arrival. He parried the Austrian's first thrust, then drove his sword hard at the man's gut. He felt the tip score into flesh before the Austrian brought his own sword back in a desperate parry. Jack recovered the blade, then slashed it at the man's face, a triumphant bellow escaping his lips as he saw it slice through his cheek. He stepped backwards, quickly, twisting to one side as the second sword came for him. He had no choice but to give ground and was forced back. A third, then a fourth cavalryman pushed their way into the room, come to exact their revenge. Revenge they would never get. The crash of the revolver was loud enough to drown out the pants and bellows of the fighting men. The Austrian nearest the door fell, his hands clasped to his back. The three men left standing whirled around. They had time to see a figure fill the doorway before the revolver fired again. In such an enclosed space it was as easy as knifing eels in a barrel, and not one bullet missed. The last 3 Austrians died within the span of a few heartbeats, the revolver used with unerring accuracy. Jack watched as the men died in front of him. It was only when the gunfire stopped that he finally lowered his bloodied blade. "You're a fucking fool." Palmer strode into the slaughterhouse, his nose twitching at the taint of blood and gun smoke that lingered in the air. "And you were damn slow in getting here." Jack bent down to retrieve his revolver from the floor, then sheathed his blood-smeared sabre. He did not look at the bodies. He turned instead to face the girl he had come to rescue. She huddled in the shadows, wrapping her torn clothes around her, looking back at Jack with eyes wide with terror. "It's all right, love. We're not like them." Jack tried to smile. The girl looked anything but reassured. "It's okay." He held up a hand. It was covered with gore. He saw the girl cringe away from him like a child recoiling from the image of a monster in a fairy tale. "Shit." He spat out the word, then turned away. He felt tired. He looked at Palmer. "I'll fetch Mary. She'll know what to do." Palmer grunted. He was checking the bodies, prodding each one with the toe of his boot to check they were truly dead. Satisfied, he glanced at the girl. "You did all this for her?" Jack made a play of checking over his revolver in lieu of answer. "Was that the reason?" Palmer repeated his question. Jack looked up. "Yes." Palmer held his gaze for a good while. Then he nodded. He did not say anything more. Chapter 23. Dawn came quickly. The night had passed peacefully, the men and women of the small hamlet providing the best they could for the foreigners who had fought and killed on their behalf. Food had been produced, and a raw red wine had washed down the evening's dinner that for once they had not had to cook for themselves. Jack walked out of the house where he had been given a bed. He had slept like the dead. He had been exhausted. The fight had drained him of every scrap of strength. He was out of condition, soft after so long sleeping in warm beds. He was not concerned. The toughness would come fast. The hard days and bitter nights of a campaign sure to harden his flesh until he could march all day and still fight at the end of it. The birds were singing, so he paused on the threshold of the house to listen to their song. The air was chill, but the sun was warm on his face, its heat dancing across his skin to leave it tingling. He closed his eyes to savour the sensation. Hearing the soft scuff of footsteps, he opened his eyes, blinking hard as the sun seared into them. He saw Mary walking towards him, a tin mug in her hands. "God save me, but tell me that is tea." Jack lifted a hand to shelter his eyes. He saw Mary smile at his greeting. The sight surprised him. He could not recall when he had last earned such a reward. "You're in luck. But it's the last of the leave, so you better enjoy it whilst you can." Jack drank in Mary's appearance as she walked towards him. He had not looked at her properly for some time, and now he glimpsed the girl he had once doted on in the woman coming towards him. She was dressed in a simple cotton dress in a warm blue fabric, a gift from the locals, and her hair was pulled back and tied behind her head. She looked clean and fresh, and he felt the stirring of an old desire. "Stop staring," Mary told him, but the rebuke was delivered with little force. She came close enough to hand over the tea. Thank you. Jack cradled the mug, luxuriating in the warmth that seeped into his hands. Is this really the last of it?
It is.
Well, don't tell Mr. Ballard that I let you have it. Then I must thank you.
You did a good thing. You deserve a reward.
Do I? Jack took a sip of the tea, closing his eyes as he savoured the taste. He would miss it. The French officers drank tart green coffee by the sackload. It was not a patch on a mug of good, thick, tarry tea.
Of course.
Mary came to stand at his side so that the sun was on her face.
You saved that poor girl.
She looked up at him, her eyes screwed almost shut against the sun.
It was a brave thing to do.
I doubt your precious Mr. Ballard would agree.
Those bastards had it coming. You gave it to them.
Mary scowled.
They deserved to die for what they were doing.
Jack snorted at her fierce words. They reminded him that Mary was harder than he gave her credit for. I'm glad I did something right for once.
For once, you did.
She turned her scowl on him.
Ma Billy thinks you're quite the hero.
The lad might be right.
No, he's not.
Mary was firm on the matter. She sighed.
He's an impressionable young boy who's never had anyone to look up to, not a man at least.
And he looks up to me.
Well, he won't for long. I'll make sure of that.
He might not listen to you.
Oh, he will. You did right to save that girl, but it doesn't make up for what happened in London.
Her words were sharp. I know that. Mary shook her head.
I don't reckon you can ever make up for that.
So I'm damned for all eternity?
Yes.
Mary's scowl softened, and she sighed.
But then, we're all damned, aren't we?
Jack understood that that was all the concession he was going to get. Then at least I'll have some company.
You will that?
Mary almost smiled.
We'll all be down there right alongside you.
Well, that's all right then. At least I won't be alone.
You will always be alone, Jack Lark.
Mary shook her head slowly as she looked up at him.
You won't ever let anyone get close to you.
Jack heard the truth in her words. It shamed him into silence. They stood together in the sun, each alone with their thoughts. The silence was only broken when they heard the sound of someone else approaching, and the girl Jack had rescued came into view carrying 2 buckets of water. The hamlet was attempting to return to normal after the traumatic events of the previous day. Mary raised a hand to wave in greeting. She was rewarded with a fleeting smile. Jack watched as the girl walked past. He might have tried to hide it, but he could not deny the pride he felt at what he'd done. Had he not intervened, her life would have ended in blood, pain, and fear. Instead, she was up and about almost as if nothing had happened. She had not been spared completely, and he was certain she would be troubled by nightmares for a long time to come, but it was a small price to pay to have avoided the fate she had faced at the hands of the Austrian cavalrymen.
She'll live.
Jack looked at Mary sharply. Her words were hard, yet he did not want to risk an argument, not after the progress they had made. So he said nothing, and contented himself with watching the girl. She walked slowly, her heavy load slowing her pace. The morning sun was behind her, and he could make out the shape of her legs through her simple cotton shift. He supposed she was beautiful in a winsome, girlish sort of way. She was the kind of girl a young lad could happily fall in love with. His reverie was brought to an abrupt halt when Mary rapped him on the arm.
Don't stare so. She's too young for you.
Jack laughed.
Am I old, then? Too old for a girl like that. She's not to my taste. She's too thin. I prefer my women with a bit of meat on their bones. He reached across and poked Mary in the side of her stomach. His hand was slapped away. But he saw the smile sneak unbidden onto her face. Don't even think about it. I wasn't. Of course you were, Mary snorted. You've been wanting to get into my drawers ever since you got hairs on your balls. Jack guffawed at her turn of phrase. So I'm not good enough for your bed? No! Never was and never will be. Harsh, but true. So you like men with a bit more gravitas? He caught her eye. Do you like the devil, then? Mary laughed the idea away. Of course not. He wouldn't have the likes of me. Jack had a trace of nervousness behind the laugh. It happens. Not to folk like me. I've seen it. Jack thought back to his previous adventure with Ballard. There had been a woman then. Her name was Sarah, and she came from a background not wholly dissimilar to Mary's. She had married well and had taken the rewards it had brought her. Fairy tales don't count, Jack. They ain't real. It wasn't a fairy tale. He reflected on how Sarah's life had played out. It was not something he would recommend, but I'm sure you're right. It's not for the likes of you. Mary opened her mouth to reply. Whatever she was about to say was lost as a sound like thunder echoed along the horizon. What the hell is that? She asked in the silence that followed. The sound came again before he could reply. This time it lasted for longer, rolling out and growing louder before stopping abruptly. Jack was already moving, calling for Palmer as he went. The bodyguard, who had been staying in the same house as Jack, came out quickly, blinking in the bright sunshine. You hear that? Jack snapped the question as the noise returned, louder than before. Palmer nodded. He said nothing. Get the mule ready. Jack gave the order before turning back to Mary. Find Billy. We need to get moving. Mary looked from one man to the other. Will one of you kindly tell me what the devil that is? She demanded, hands on hips. Palmer ignored her and went off to find the mule. Mary grabbed Jack's arm, making him face her. What is it? She repeated. Guns. Artillery, anyway, Jack replied. Someone has just started a battle. They had left quickly. The locals had not seen them off. Jack got the sense they were relieved at their departure. They might have saved one of their girls from being ravaged, but they were still strangers. Their presence was tolerated, but they were a reminder of a day the villagers would spend years trying to forget. What do you make of it? Ballard walked at Jack's side. His legs were shorter than Jack's, so he was forced to move them quickly to keep pace. It's no skirmish. Jack cocked an ear. The noise of the guns was constant now, intensifying the closer they got. He felt a part of him awakening at the sound. Then we must move quickly. We are. Jack heard the anxiety in Ballard's voice. He did not recall seeing his commander this tense. Well, we must keep up the pace. We shall not stop, not for anything. Then save your breath for marching. Jack's reply was waspish. It earned him a scowl. Do not forget why we are here. Ballard ignored Jack's advice. I have not forgotten your actions. You think I did the wrong thing? Jack scoffed at his master's words. You disobeyed me. I saved that girl. Ballard did not reply immediately. When he did, his voice was like ice. We have a duty to find this boy. I vowed to his father that we would keep him safe. I intend to keep my word. We might not even find him. A battle's a bloody big place. We have a whole army to search through." "Nonsense." Ballard's reply was immediate. "I know his regiment. It will be a simple enough task to find them." And then what? Jack felt his breath catch in his chest. They were walking briskly, and the advice to save their breath had not been solely for Ballard's benefit. "Then you will keep him safe. When the opportunity arises, you take him away." "What, we ask him to come with us?" Jack mocked his commander. "Swan in there and pluck him out of their bloody line? You think they'll just let him go?" "Of course not. But I'm sure a man of your talents will be able to find a way. Until then, you will keep him safe. You and Palmer know how to fight. Use that knowledge to protect the boy." Jack bit off a sharp retort. He was tweaking the tail of the devil, and he would do well to mind his tongue. Ballard was not a man to cross. "Let's find him first. Then we can decide what to do next." He tried to mollify his commander. "You will do more than that," Ballard snapped his reply. "I brought you here for this, and this alone. When you find him, you will protect him in any way you can, no matter what it takes." Jack understood the tone. There was no need to reply, so he saved his breath for what was to come. Chapter 24. The French army was on the move. The enemy had finally been forced into action. Now Napoleon had the chance to test the mettle of his troops on the field of battle. His Second Corps, commanded by General de Division MacMahon, was marching to take up position to make an attack. Ballard's small party was caught up in the rush. They had left the hamlet behind and marched towards the sound of the guns. Within an hour, they were back in the midst of the French army as it manoeuvred towards the Austrian force. The road was clogged with men, horses, and wagons. Progress was slow, and the column they followed was frequently forced to stand idle in the sun as the road ahead became blocked. "This is chaos." Ballard made his verdict on the continued delays clear. Jack looked around. To his mind, the column was as ordered as it could be. The French army was reacting well and moving at a decent pace. "It's not so bad. Don't panic." "Panic, indeed." Ballard glared at him, his face flushed. "Ah, Jack, quickly now. Stop that fellow." The Major had spotted a rider trying to force a passage through the column. Jack did what he was told. It was easy enough to wait for the rider to get close. Then it was a simple matter of grabbing his bridle and tugging him to a halt. "Monsieur!" Ballard stepped up to the man's stirrup before he could snap at Jack to release his bridle. "Major Ballard, British intelligence, attached to General MacMahon." He shouted the fleeting introduction. The French officer looked anything but impressed. "What do you want?" "Be quick now, I have an urgent dispatch for General de Castagny." His English was good. "Where is General MacMahon's headquarters?" The Frenchman scowled. "A mile ahead, perhaps less. They spent the night bivouacked around Turbigo. Now please let go of my bridle." "What has happened?" Ballard clearly did not care for the Frenchman's supercilious attitude. "The Austrians happened, monsieur. They hold the high ground around Magenta." "You did not expect them to be so far north, did you?" "Perhaps not. But now we have them and we can bring them to battle." "What of their numbers?" 40,000, perhaps more." The French officer's horse tossed its head, forcing Jack to wrestle with it to maintain his hold. "Monsieur, I must get on." "One last question. What are your orders?" "To attack the enemy, as quickly as we can." Ballard stood back, then gestured for Jack to let the man's bridle go. He had learned enough. The second major engagement of the campaign had begun. The man's arm was gone. All that was left was a bloody stump liberally swathed in bandages now soaked with gore. Yet he still found the strength to wave at Mary as the cart he was on went past.
his face creasing into a smile as he spotted her blue cotton dress amidst the sea of uniforms. They had been walking for hours, and it was now early afternoon. They had crossed the river Ticino on a pontoon bridge at Turbigo before passing through another village called Robercetto as they tried to catch up with MacMahon's Second Corps. The number of casualties coming back the other way had increased with every mile. The French were well organised, and so far all the wounded they had seen were being taken away from the front line in ambulances and wagons standing ready for just that purpose. Poor bastards. Jack stood back to let the next cart pass. 6 men were on board. All were wounded, their faces bearing the strain of being maimed in the opening salvos of the battle.
They're the lucky ones.
Palmer stood grim-faced at his side. Come along. It was Ballard who G'd them up. We must get going. Palmer caught Jack's eye and shrugged. He moved away, quick to obey. Jack took one last look at the cart full of wounded soldiers making slow progress against the tide of fresh troops marching the other way. Then he followed the others. They made their way into a small town that a few quick questions allowed them to identify as Cugiono. The column they had attached themselves to pressed on, the men marching quicker now. The noise of the artillery fire had increased, the sound pounding out without pause, the air shaking with every salvo. Jack could smell the battlefield in the whiff of powder smoke drifting on the breeze, and in the tang of blood as each wagon ground its way past. They passed silent houses, their windows shuttered and doors barred. Any inhabitants were hiding away deep inside, those foolish enough not to have fled at the sound of the first guns, now at least wise enough to stay out of sight. Tricolours hung from empty balconies, forlorn and abandoned. The hasty celebrations that had marked the arrival of the French army had been quickly forgotten as the locals realised they were now on the front line of a battle. Orders came faster now. Riders rushed past the slow-moving column, their faces flushed and excited as they galloped between senior officers, passing commands and information, their horses snorting and whinnying as they were ridden hard. Ballard pulled out a little black leather notebook and scribbled a quick series of notes with a pencil. They were now on the eastern flank of the Ticino River, at the western edge of the Lombard Plain, a great plateau that stretched for miles until it reached a far line of hills. The ground closest to the river was poor, and Jack saw that the flooded fields would be a nightmare for the infantry. The plateau itself was largely unbroken open ground, save for a scattering of dense patches of fruit trees. The fields to either side of the road were planted to crops, and he could see the lead battalion of the column flattening a field of wheat as they manoeuvred. "Where are the enemy?" Ballard came close to Jack's side and bellowed the question in his ear. Orders were being shouted back and forth as the troops in front of them deployed off the road, marching to the right to clear the way for the men in the battalion ahead. "Over there!" Jack waved an arm to point ahead. He was trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The French battalions were forming up in line at right angles to the road. A large number of French artillery pieces were already there, massed in a single enormous battery facing south. They were firing fast, the gunners sweating around their heavy cannon. "I see." Ballard was making quick sketches in his little book. "Once we are reformed, will we sweep forward?" "No." Jack shook his head. He understood the French formation better than his commander. "The frogs are going on the defensive." Ballard's face creased into a scowl. "How so?" "If they were going to attack, they would be staying in column." Jack looked up and down the French line. "This is a defensive formation." "Which means what, precisely?" "Which means they reckon the bloody Austrians are coming this way. The French are preparing for defeat." "Are you sure?" Ballard's disbelief was obvious. "Yes. They're preparing to cover a retreat." As if to emphasise the notion, the French guns fired another salvo. "There is still fighting ahead." Ballard jabbed a finger. "And it looks like the Frenchies are taking a pounding." Palmer made the announcement as he came to stand at their side. Jack looked where Palmer was indicating. A stream of fresh casualties was swarming back along the road. Some were in ambulances, whilst others came alone or walking in pairs. There were many more than they had seen already, the fighting getting heavier and more destructive. Most were making for a first aid post set up on the edge of the town. The post flew a black flag to let both sides know that it was a place of refuge and not a target. "Keep the boy away," Ballard snapped the order at Mary. Billy had led the mule forward with his mother, and now the lad was staring at the sad procession of broken bodies. "I ain't bothered," Billy protested. "I've seen worse." "Come on. Never mind the lad, we need to get off the road." Jack spied another battalion of French infantrymen advancing behind them. "Good idea." Ballard scanned around. "Head towards the aid station. I shall endeavour to find the commander of this battalion. With luck, he can tell me where our man might be. Palmer, stay with me. Jack, take the others." He gave his orders quickly. It was time to try to make sense of the confusion and find their target. "I have news." Ballard made the announcement as he bustled over to where his small party waited for his return, not far from the first aid post. "No one quite knows where anyone is." He shook his head as he came to stand in front of Jack. "You would think a damned general would know where his own men might be. It's a battle. This is what they're like." Jack snorted at Ballard's crass comment. He nodded to a grim-faced Palmer, who trailed dutifully in his master's wake. "Well, it should be more organised. I'm certain Wellington knew better." "I'm sure he didn't." Ballard glared at Jack, but Palmer laughed, earning a sharp look of his own. "That's enough." Ballard pulled out his notebook and flicked through to the last page. "Now, listen carefully. The enemy are about 2 miles ahead. McMahon's corps was advancing on 2 fronts, but it appears the divisions have become separated. His right division, under General de la Motte Rouge, is at a place called Boffalora, a couple of miles to the south of here. They had nearly reached the town's bridge when McMahon ordered them to hold their ground. We are with his reserve column. They have been ordered to consolidate here with the bulk of his artillery." Jack nodded. It made sense of what he could see around him. The general had ordered his reserve column to join his artillery so as to provide a solid defensive position to anchor the attack should his 2 main divisions be forced to pull back. That still begged the obvious question. So the 1st Division is at Boffalora. The reserves are here. Where is the 2nd Division? The 2nd Division, under Espinasse, was advancing out on the left. McMahon lost contact with them a couple of hours ago. So where's our man? Jack opted not to pass comment on the skill of a general who somehow managed to lose a whole division. "We know that he serves in the French Foreign Legion. They form a part of Espinasse's division. And no one knows where they are." Jack absorbed the news. "No." Ballard spotted something in Jack's reaction that led him to purse his lips, but he did not let it stop him continuing with his news. "There are reports that the 2nd Division's lead regiment was also advancing on Boffalora shortly before the 1st Division got there. Others say they are held up at a place called Marcello, a mile or so to the left of our advance." He looked up. "That must be over there to the east." "What is your good friend, the general, doing to find his men?" Jack tried to make sense of the conflicting reports. It was clear that the truth of the matter was that no one knew where the 2nd Division had gone. "He has patrols scouring the area. However, the Austrians are now counter-attacking all along the line, and MacMahon is worried that his men will be pushed back. If the Austrians can force their way into the gap between his two divisions, there will be no one to stop them crushing the whole French flank. So it's a bloody mess. Their situation is rather fluid, yes. And what do we do? Ballard's eyes narrowed at the question. There is only one thing to do, Jack. We go and get our man. We? Ballard gave one of his rare smiles. It was not reassuring. You and Palmer are the best men for this job. As much as I may wish it were otherwise, I know I would only slow you down. We will stay here. I want you to head east. Find this village called Marcello. It's as good a place for you to start as any. Jack glanced at Palmer. The big man's face was impassive. So be it. He looked back at Ballard. So what's this bugger's name, then? His name is not important. Ballard scowled at the question. Jack was not deterred by his commander's expression. Of course it is. How else are we to find him? I don't know his name. Ballard gave the admission through gritted teeth. At least what name he is using currently. You don't know? Jack could not help the smile creeping on his face. You don't know? He repeated the question with relish. No, Jack, I do not. So, what does he look like, then? We need something to go on, or are we supposed to interrogate every man we find to see if he's someone's son and heir? Ballard did his best to ignore the barb. He dug in a pocket and pulled out a miniature portrait, which he handed to Jack. This is the image I was given of the boy. Jack looked at the portrait. The face of a boy stared back at him. He could not have been more than 10 or 11 years old. He had a shock of blonde hair and bright blue eyes. Blow me, are we looking for a nipper? It is a little out of date, I grant you, but his features are recognizable enough. Jack snorted. It was not much to go on. How old is he now? 22. And where did you get this? His father gave it to me. Now you have your orders and you know what must be done. Ballard moved the conversation along briskly. Your first task is to keep the boy safe, no matter what it takes. Then, when the opportunity occurs, you will bring him to me. He turned away, his orders given. Jack caught Palmer's eye. The big man shrugged. Jack wanted to say something to Mary, but she was already fussing over Ballard and did not look his way. So he did what he was told and followed Palmer to war.